Honourable members, the Deputy Speaker.
Are there any constituency statements by honourable members? And I call the member for Mackellar.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Last week was Remembrance Day and I was privileged to attend Forestville RSL in my electorate of Mackellar to honour servicemen and women who have made the ultimate sacrifice for our nation. But, Deputy Speaker, our veterans deserve more than remembrance. They need far greater support than they are currently receiving, particularly during the often difficult transition time from service to civilian life. As a GP, I'm aware of the devastating impact service may have on the lives of veterans. There may be physical wounds and there may be deep psychological wounds. The transition to civilian life can often be extremely challenging because of the loss of community, camaraderie, supports and routine. We have just seen the completion of the Royal Commission into Veteran Suicide, and in the last sitting week, the Veterans Entitlement, Treatment and Support Bill passed through this House. But on the ground, in Mackellar, veterans often still lack the support they need. Simple things like adequate support for health services. As an example, a number of physiotherapists in Mackellar have written to me to explain what is really an unacceptable situation. Currently, DVA reimbursement rates are insufficient to cover the actual cost of physio care, leaving physios unable to provide critical services such as pain management, rehabilitation, falls prevention and musculoskeletal treatments without financial loss. These services are essential to veterans' physical and mental well-being, as noted by the Royal Commission, which highlighted the impact of chronic pain on mental health. Many physios, out of their compassion and commitment to the veteran community, have continued providing care despite being out of pocket. However, this underfunding and reliance on physios' goodwill is not sustainable and will compromise veterans' access to this important aspect of their health care. The Australian Physiotherapy Association suggests aligning DVA rebates with the NDIS fee schedule to ensure fair compensation for physiotherapy services. I have written to the Minister for Veterans Affairs and urged him to act to ensure our veterans are getting the health support they deserve. I would also like to take this opportunity to make a shout out to the fabulous saltwater veterans, whose core vision is to cultivate a connected community of veterans and their families through engagement with water activities. The Saltwater Veterans Sailing Project is all about supporting fellow wounded, injured and sick veterans and their family and friends. If you are a veteran, get on down to the Royal Prince Alfred Yacht Club in Newport on Sydney's northern beaches and join and support this terrific endeavour. Thank you.
Call the member for Lingiari.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. In a sobering public statement on the 15th of October 2024, following the latest senseless killing, this time out at La Germano, Assistant Commissioner Travis Worst of the Northern Territory Police echoed the thoughts of many of us. He said of the continuing deaths, that tragedy is one that the Northern Territory cannot ignore. 7 matters being investigated by the Northern Territory Police as domestic violence since the 1st of June this year, and a further death happening last week in Katherine of a woman dying at the hands of her partner. The new CLP government has a mandate to address crime issues, and they would no doubt say that it is a matter for them how they go about doing that. But when it comes to revisiting legislation, it was surprising to me that a priority step was not to reinstate the sentencing arrangements which has been in place under both Labor and the CLP governments for many years in respect of breaching domestic violence orders. The rule was very simple and straightforward. There was a minimum mandatory sentencing for breaching a domestic violence order, and it could not be doubled up with any other sentence imposed on the offender. This is not to say enforcing the law in relation to breaching DVOs is by in itself going to stop domestic homicides, but it is about sending a message. What message are we sending out there if sentences you get for breaching DVOs can get buried in and made meaningless by the imposition of concurrent sentences for some other offences? I've written to the Chief Minister proposing a number of things and said that we would work with her to try and address this increasing rate of Aboriginal women dying in a terrible way by their partners, and it has to stop. Lastly, there is a rally call for men on the Monday, the 25th of November in Darwin to say it has to stop on the 25th of November in Darwin, and then again on the 5th of the 12th in December in Alice Springs, where Aboriginal men and just male leaders right throughout the Northern Territory are coming together to say we have to be the solution, not the problem. These deaths have to stop, and we have to do everything in our power, whether it's federally, whether it's with the state, whether it's local government, but we do have to stop these deaths, because it's surprising, and it shouldn't be surprising, that not one of these women's faces or names get lit up in the media when they die at the hands of their domestic partners. And that is a crime in itself, that nobody sees the urgency in these deaths, which are increasing throughout the Northern Territory. Thank you.
I call the member for Flinders.
In a recent conversation with a good friend, I was told that bipartisan support for a social media ban for kids under 16 was a bad move. It should be up to families to govern access to social media, he said. It's a fair point. It's a reasonable point, one with which, on a matter of principle, I would normally agree. But today's culture of breakneck, busy parenting makes that a painfully optimistic view. Families do not govern access to social media. Parents are flat chat, working 2 jobs to cover their surging mortgage repayments. And in Melbourne, 36 weeks of digital homeschooling smashed all semblance of digital diet moderation. From the time Facebook and Instagram introduced the like buttons, creating an immediate dopamine loop, social media's maxim has been user engagement. The addictive qualities of these attributes get their richest rewards from those whose prefrontal cortex, regulating human impulses and driving reasoning, is as yet underdeveloped in those who are under 20. To capture an audience, each scroll or autoplay serves up slightly more scintillating or extreme versions of whatever it is the user wanted to watch. It is why, as Reset Tech was able to prove recently, a teenage boy will move from a self-actualisation motivational talk by Jordan Peterson to violent, misogynistic content from Andrew Tate within 70 minutes of scrolling. With each autoplay, the content just gets more scintillating or more extreme. According to the Australian Gaming and Screens Alliance, the average Australian child spends 9 hours a day in screen-based leisure time. 9 hours a day. We need to think about the opportunity cost of those 9 hours. In The Anxious Generation, Jonathan Haidt talked about the loss of the play-based childhood. And in her work iGen, Jean Twenge, her list was even longer. The loss of adequate sleep, physical health, face-to-face socialising, the rites of passage of adulthood, including getting a job or a car licence or even a boyfriend or a girlfriend. As Haidt would argue in his other works, we have entered an era of safetyism, thinking that the kids are safer on the couch with their digital toys than at the shopping centre or the footy field. But they are not safer. The evidence of real harm done by social media we've heard through the Social Media Committee, it was nothing short of heartbreaking. And I recommend to all the testimony of parents, Ali Halchik, Danny Alachi, Emma Mason and Wayne Holdsworthy. Young people will of course protest. They want their online lives, but the world will not end. Children will go back to being children, and maybe in time, social media platforms will take their responsibility to our children more seriously. It will right, I am confident. There will be ethical social media one day, as the French postulate in their Enfant et Con report released earlier this year, but we will not get there without some form of regulation. Leave things as they are and the huge profit that comes from commodifying our kids and their concentration, we will just get more of what we have today. Social media that is driving our children to distraction and stupidity at best and to real harm at worst via bullying, sextortion, scams and frauds, as well as radicalisation, extremism, child sexual abuse and other illegal
has
activities.
Expired, and I call the member for Solomon.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. Community mental health, including youth and veteran mental health, is a matter that's very close to my heart. I'm committed to delivering hubs in my electorate of Solomon that engage and support youth and veterans. We delivered a Veterans and Families Hub last year with the opening of the Mates for Mates Veteran and Family Wellbeing Centre in Stuart Park, and there is outreach services to Palmerston. Previously, there was an interim wellbeing centre in Palmerston. This centre in Darwin provides vital services to veterans and their families in the top end. I look forward to working with the NT Government to realise our government's funding commitments to deliver the Casuarina Youth Engagement Hub and the Scott Palmer Centre in Marara. We are investing $5 million to build the Youth Engagement Hub in Casuarina. The NT Government will provide ongoing operational funding and the land. And the hub is another step closer with the recent removal of the old Casuarina Fire Station, and that part of this project is almost complete. I am absolutely delighted to see this progress on the Casuarina Youth Engagement Hub. However, there's much work to do still, and there should be no delays. This hub will support vital support for young Territorians. The design and consultation work has been done, so better support and facilities for our young people should not be far away. I'm also committed to working with the NT Government to deliver the Scott Palmer Centre. Scott Palmer was a commando and the only Territorian that was killed in the conflict in Afghanistan. He tragically lost his life in a helicopter crash on Monday, 21st of June 2010. And Scott's parents, Ray and Pam Palmer, have turned their grief in losing their son into a passion for assisting veterans, not just in the Northern Territory, but around our nation. The Scott Palmer Centre will support veterans and first responders who are either homeless or at risk of homelessness. The Albanese Labor Government committed $3.6 million for this Veterans and First Responder supported housing hub in Darwin at the site of the old Darwin North RSL. And the NT Government had committed $300,000 to make the site ready for the handover and for construction to begin. I look forward to working with the NT Government on these very important projects for young Territorians and for Territory veterans.
I call the member for Sturt.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I rise to welcome the important body of work recently released by the Shadow Minister for Energy and Climate Change undertaken by Frontier Economics, a very important contribution to public policy and frankly something that is also highly alarming and concerning, because what it has revealed, of course, is that the cost of the current government's plans when it comes to energy generation into the future for this country that they claimed would cost a little over $100 billion, in fact is going to cost more than $600 billion, thanks to this independent analysis from Frontier Economics. And so we welcome that important clarification that is on the record and not being disputed in any academic or significant or scientific way by anyone that knows anything about this topic. In fact, Frontier Economics have quite a heritage in working for Labor governments, and they are very highly respected by those Labor governments. And Mr Danny Price, the founder of Frontier Economics, is a very consistent advisor to the South Australian Labor government in my home state, and both former Premier Jay Weatherill and current Premier Peter Malinauskas have engaged him to undertake major analysis and consultations for them when they've been undertaking significant policy development when it comes to energy. And so it's no surprise to me, given Danny Price is such a consistent advisor to Peter Malinauskas, that of course he is such a consistent advocate for nuclear. And indeed, it was just a few months ago that Premier Peter Malinauskas made the important point, and I quote him, "I'm okay with the presence of a nuclear industry within our country, and I mean more broadly. I actually firmly believe that nuclear power is a necessary part of the global energy mix if we're going to achieve net zero by 2050. Labor Premier of South Australia, Peter Malinauskas. And he's not a Johnny-come-lately to this debate either. In fact, before he was in the Parliament, he was a very consistent advocate for nuclear energy in this country. When he was the Shop Distributive and Allied Employees Association State Secretary. This is back in 2014. He said the following: "I believe climate change is a real challenge we need to face up to, and nuclear energy can be a safe source of base load power with zero carbon emissions. Thus, I find it contradictory and irresponsible when I see the Greens and environmentalists outright opposing nuclear power." So that's the view of the Labor Party in my home state of South Australia, and whilst I don't make a habit of agreeing with the South Australian Labor government, I do on this issue. Peter Malinauskas is quite right. We do need nuclear power in this country. It's a vital part of securing our energy security into the future, and I commend him for his bravery in standing up to Anthony Albanese and his petty opposition to nuclear.
I call the member for Reid.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. Yesterday, the member for Hughes came to the chamber to question the government's advocacy for women and girls around the world. Her statement was factually incorrect, politically motivated and deeply offensive. So let me set the record straight. The Albanese Labor government has a proud record of advocating for the rights of women and girls both at home and abroad. We believe that women and girls of Afghanistan deserve the full enjoyment of their human rights. That is why we have taken unprecedented action to hold the Taliban to account for its violation of obligations under the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. For the women and girls in Iran, the Albanese government was the first Australian government to sanction Iran for the oppression of women and girls. I remind the member for Hughes, it was this government that successfully advocated to remove Iran from the Commission on the Status of Women. The former coalition government was silent when Iran was elected to the UN Commission for the Status of Women. For the women and girls in the Middle East, the Albanese government has consistently condemned Hamas for their actions and called for the release of hostages. In October last year, both houses passed a bipartisan motion that unequivocally condemned the attacks on Israel by Hamas and their targeting of women and girls. It is a shame that the member for Hughes did not pay attention to this important debate at the time. When the Foreign Minister went to Israel, she met with the chair of Israel's Civil Commission on October 7 crimes by Hamas against women and children, where she again condemned Hamas's use of sexual violence as a weapon. In this debate, the only hypocrisy comes from the Liberals who refuse to acknowledge the humanitarian crisis Palestinian civilians are facing: men, women, girls and boys. Deputy Speaker, there is a little girl born today who will never know physical safety, who will never be able to go to school, who will be forced into marriage at 14, who will not be afforded the opportunities given to little girls in Australia. Her wings are clipped because of the country she was born in. Grandstanding speeches from the member for Hughes will not help that little girl, won't end the cycle of violence in the Middle East, won't bring justice to women and girls in Afghanistan, and won't help women in Iran. But the consistent hard work of this government will.
I call the member for Moncrieff.
Well, a cost of living crisis, increased energy costs, higher interest rates and soaring inflation has made this year a tough one for Australians. 2024 has seen the cost of all essentials rise by at least 10%, and the standard of living in our great country simply go backwards. Australians are poorer under this government, and they're feeling the pinch as we enter the festive season. And through what has been a particularly challenging year, our dedicated community leaders in Moncrieff continue to step up to support Gold Coasters to address their needs. To the many community groups that serve Moncrieff, St John's Crisis Centre, Serving Our People, Have a Feed and Oz Harvest, your volunteer work has eased the burden and brightened the world for so many locals. To the Frizzell Foundation, the Gold Coast Community Fund, the Ray White Surfers Paradise Ball for muscular dystrophy, the Obedience Foundation, and so many more for donating and fundraising to help those less fortunate. Thank you for always going above and beyond to provide critical support for those who suffer food insecurity, homelessness, domestic violence or abuse. And in the lead up to and over the festive season, there becomes a heightened need for this support. For all the work that you do as your federal member and one who cares deeply about everybody in Moncrieff, I thank you. To my Moncrieff Community Cabinet, made up of community and faith leaders, and the Gold Coast Youth Cabinet, thank you for your commitment and dedication to Gold Coasters. I acknowledge our Gold Coast business leaders, the great captains of our engine room, for your resilience this year in the face of significant uncertainty, rising costs and a Labor government actively working against you. To the 9 surf clubs in Moncrieff and their volunteers, Southport, Surfers Paradise, Northcliffe, Broadbeach, Kurrawa, Mermaid Beach and Nobby's Beach, Miami Surf Club and North Burleigh. Thank you for the integral role you play within our coastal community and ahead of time for the big hours that you put in over the Christmas break and summer holidays to keep us all safe between the flags. To the good people of Moncrieff, I admire you greatly and I admire your determination, your discipline, your hard work, your good humour and of course your dedication to your families and to our communities. It continues to be a great privilege and honour to represent you in this place. May you all have a very safe and Merry Christmas and a happy and prosperous New Year for 2025. And I look forward, particularly in the coming months, to seeing you out and about in our beautiful electorate at engagements and events across Moncrieff.
I call the member for Moreton.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. There are 50 schools in Moreton. One I particularly love to visit is Milperra, because they produce people like Corporal Hasham Hamid, who's here in the chamber, born in Egypt of parents from Sudan and then ended up in the Australian Army. Milperra educates the children of refugees and people from migrant backgrounds. It's essentially Brisbane's intensive English language preparation centre. Milperra aims to facilitate good settlement and a strong sense of belonging through carefully chosen learning experiences. Students learn how to thrive in an Australian classroom. In some cases, children have never, ever been inside a classroom or taken any formal education classes in their first language or even their second language. The teachers of Milperra are very experienced and are qualified to teach English as an additional language. Milperra also has a number of bilingual teacher aides who provide cultural support as well as helping students with their acquisition of English. Children learn the ways of working in an Australian classroom through the school's key values of being hardworking, respectful, kind and ready for learning. The student-centred curriculum uses highly contextualised language learning experiences and ensures that students develop the English language needed for their future learning pathways, whether that be in the Army or other directions. The school has also developed one of Queensland's Department of Education's largest volunteer teams. Children spend about 18 months at Milperra on average before they are then able to attend a school closer to home, such as Yeronga State High. I went to Milperra for their recent NAIDOC Week celebrations, had a quick tour with Acting Principal Julie Peel. She introduced me to 2 students, Ang and Rachel. Ang had arrived from Vietnam and Rachel from France via Canada. Ang and Rachel took me through a PowerPoint they'd prepared as part of their assessment to build an argument and convince the audience of their point of view. Ang and Rachel had carefully structured their arguments and provided well-researched evidence to support their points of view in their new language, in English.
Division has been called for in the House. The proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division, and the proceedings will resume when the Chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or subsequent divisions. I call the member for Moreton in continuation.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. After meeting Ange and Rachel, we then joined Milpera's NAIDOC Week celebrations. It was wonderful to see the voices of our oldest living culture speaking to, and also this nation's newest voices. And to quote the poem, irrespective of where my ancestral village is, the earth feeds the heart. Great affection for their loyalty to here. To tell people they can't serve two masters starts with the assumption that they are a servant. The free serve no one. The good ones help all but serve nobody. So thank you, Milpera. Thank you very much to Ange and Rachel. Thank you, Milpera, for a wonderful work experience at NAIDOC, but for all the many, many students you have turned out over the years, including for giving us Corporal Hasham Hamid, who I hope will go on to have a long, healthy career in the ADF and not be scarred by his time here at Parliament.
I call the member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. Between the dates of October the 27th to November the 2nd, I was given the great privilege as co-chair of the Friends of Morocco at the request of the Moroccan government to lead a delegation to Morocco. One of the reasons I am signed up to be a friend of Morocco was because I had the privilege of visiting the country before I entered Parliament, in fact, and was quite impressed with what I saw there at that stage, but was very much more impressed with what I saw in our trip back to Morocco just a couple of weeks ago. It is a vibrant democracy, and I would say, without any shadow of doubt in my mind, the most successful democracy in the Arab world. It's enlightened, it's led by a vibrant parliament and a very enlightened King Mohammed VI, and they are a very tolerant society where women are encouraged in education, in the workforce, in management and in parliament, and they have very good representation. So it is wonderful to see that in a predominantly Muslim nation in a fairly troubled part of the world. I think they set a wonderful example. They are having huge investment in education and training. We've visited some of their facilities. They have a free trade agreement with Europe, and in 2012, I think it was, Renault opened a car factory near Tangier, where they now make 340,000 units a year, which are going directly, most of them directly back into the EU, tariff-free, of course. They built a port, Tangier Med, which they opened, I think, in 2007. So it is now the biggest port in the Mediterranean and shifting 9 million containers a year. As a result of that, they are building another port down at Layoun, which is in the contested area of the Western Sahara, which Morocco would like our support, along with 100 other countries around the world, to recognise their autonomous administration there. And they're building a third port, again, in Western Morocco, on Eastern Morocco on the Mediterranean. I'm indebted to the help of Madam Wassan Zalakchi, the ambassador here in Australia, and the Moroccans have asked that we try and get the government moving in the way of free trade agreement with Morocco. Subsequently, since I've come back, I have written on behalf of the delegation, which included the member for Adelaide, to ask the Trade Minister, Don Farrell, to open those negotiations. Verbally, I think Steve Georgianis has had that kind of advice that he will be open to that, but I'll be looking forward to pushing forward with that agenda.
I call the member for Werriwa.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise today to give voice to my community, to give voice to their grief, their horror, their distress, their sorrow and anger. As I have before, today I speak of Gaza. It has been over a year of deliberate, targeted and unrelenting carnage. Let me be clear, there is no possible justification for what has happened, for the tens of thousands of deaths that have occurred in the past year alone. I condemn the Netanyahu government's senseless murder of innocent civilians, of innocent children. I repeat, there is no justification for the murder of children. I condemn Netanyahu's wanton destruction that has killed aid workers and journalists. I condemn the barbaric campaign that is set on ensuring the utter annihilation of the Palestinian people. The Netanyahu government has blocked humanitarian aid. They've locked down the borders, trapping those trying to flee. They've cut off access to the most basic of human needs, food and water. Israel cannot be allowed to continue their campaign with the Palestinians or the people of Lebanon. I call on the Netanyahu government to cease all hostilities immediately, withdraw all troops and instate a ceasefire. This is the bare minimum that must be done right now, today. This is what the people in my community are asking for. I've had many conversations with residents. A community representative I spoke with last week, Julie Karaki. Overall, their message is a feeling of sense of powerlessness, that they are not being listened to. They see unimaginable suffering occurring and they need it to stop. Suffering is suffering, whether you see it 12 kilometres away or 12,000. I thank everyone in my community who's contacted me and spoken to me again about this. I recognise and admire that in spite of their feelings of despair, they believe that they can make a difference and the world should make a difference, and they need their voices to be heard. They still believe they do have a say in this country. I'm honoured to represent them and say with their voice that we all, the whole world, must do better and must represent them. The only path forward is a Netanyahu government to stop now, for justice to be administered and for the implementation of a Palestinian state with Israel and Palestine equal partners in the area.
In accordance with Standing Order 193, the time for members' constituency statements has concluded and I call the clerk.
Government business, order of the day number 1, Migration Amendment Bill 2024, resumption of debate on second reading.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time and I call the member for Melbourne.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. We've seen in the US someone rise to power trying to get around the legal system, to ignoring the courts and punching down on migrants. That sort of politics makes the world a worse place. This bill, though, is part of that race to the bottom on migration that we are seeing from Liberal and Labor. This bill builds on the cruel regime of offshore detention and processing that started over a decade ago, deliberately subjecting thousands of people to torturous conditions. The High Court found in YBFZ and Minister of Immigration, Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs that the government cannot inflict punitive conditions like ankle monitors and curfews on people recently released from detention. Now, instead of listening to the courts and listening to the rule of law, the government sought not only to get around the courts, but also to introduce sweeping changes to the migration system. This bill will effectively allow governments to bribe other countries to take people that Australia is forcibly removing from Australia. Someone can be removed to a third country when they are without a visa or on a bridging visa, BVR, and cannot return to their country of origin. That is thousands of people. This law cannibalises part of Labor's failed Trump-style travel ban bill. In particular, it allows the government to force people to choose between indefinite detention or forced removal to a third country where they have no rights or protections. Based on past practices, these third countries are likely to be Nauru, PNG or even Cambodia. They can be countries with very poor human rights records. And indeed, where it can be a criminal offence to identify as LGBTIQ+. Now, of course, many other countries would point to laws like this to legitimately criticise Australia's human rights protections. Once people are deported to that third country, there are no protections, and the country does not even need to be a signatory to the Refugee Convention. So we're talking about deporting under this law deporting people to countries that don't even need to be signatory to the Refugee Convention. It would even be lawful under this bill for people to be deported to a third country only to be placed in jail or immigration detention immediately on arrival. It is most definitely not a requirement of this bill that people are given work or other basic rights on arrival. In fact, the only protections in this bill are for the decision makers, who cannot be held liable for sending people to third countries, even if they are aware it is likely to cause them serious harm. That's what this bill does. It provides immunity for the government and decision makers to say you can send someone to another country even if you are aware it is likely to cause that person serious harm. You know that the government is about to do something very bad when a large part of the bill is dedicated to making sure that people cannot be held to account for the decisions that they are making. We've already seen, in the context of Nauru and PNG, that Australia effectively bribes third countries to commit what, on any reasonable interpretation, are human rights abuses on Australia's behalf, and it has lasting damage on people, to the people that we send there, but also to political and moral standards here. This bill also gives the government the unrestricted ability to share criminal records with any other government to help facilitate the removal of people to third countries. This means you could have a situation where someone could flee, say, Saudi Arabia because they criminalise homosexuality there, only to have the Australian government force that person into a third country that also criminalises homosexuality and share their criminal record. Like, all of that is now permissible under this bill. That is what people are voting on here. Now, there's principles that we in the Greens hold dear and that most people in this country, I think, would hold dear, which is that when someone commits an offence, they go to court and the judge decides what happens. That's how the law works, and it only works because everyone is treated the same. The government here, though, wants to create a new quasi-legal system to allow politicians and bureaucrats to punish people outside of the courts, and that is a clear threat to the rule of law in this country. Just this week, I met with people who were subjected to the cruel and unfair fast-track system. This system was abolished because Labor worked with the Greens to end it. However, those who were failed by that system remain in limbo, without a pathway to permanency. I met someone who came here alone as a child over a decade ago. The government prevents him from studying. I met another man who was working in construction and building homes, and then, out of nowhere, the government stopped renewing his visa and he's been unable to work. Under this bill, that person who fled a country fearing persecution, lived here for over a decade, worked here and paid taxes. Well, he can now be forced to choose between detention forever or forcible removal to a country like PNG or Nauru. That's what this bill does. Now, the government, we know, will try and demonise and dehumanise migrants and refugees when passing this bill. But make no mistake, the people who will be punished are those like the people rejected from fast track. People, in many instances, who want nothing more than to live here and live a good life for themselves and their families. For this reason, we support the member for Wentworth's amendments, which seek to address some of the bill's cruelest aspects, such as reducing who can be forcibly removed. However, we still reject the fundamental assumptions that this bill makes, that the government is able to extrajudicially punish people. The High Court made it clear that the law needs to be applied equally to everyone, no matter where you come from, and that you cannot have bureaucrats and politicians punishing people outside the courts. That's what the High Court decided. It does not need to be this way. It is set out in the legislation. The Greens are asking Labor to work with us to protect multicultural Australia and to stop the fear and division around migrants and refugees. It is very, very concerning to hear, for example, even the Minister for Immigration yesterday in question time saying, like giving repetition to the argument pushed by the likes of the Leader of the Opposition, that somehow people who are unable to find a home have migrants to blame. We are witnessing a very distressing race to the bottom again at this election, where Labor and Liberal outcompete each other as to who can punish migrants more. We have seen this happen at previous elections. And one of the things about the Leader of the Opposition is that when it comes to punching down on migrants, he'll just keep going. And I urge Labor to stop joining in this race to the bottom, because it's a race you can never win. And it will hurt multicultural Australia. It will hurt migrants and refugees. The only way to take on those who seek to demonise migrants and refugees is to stand firm on principle, including principles of the rule of law and including principles of multiculturalism. This election could be a very dirty and distressing race to the bottom on migration, and it looks like it's going that way. And this bill is another example of that. You don't beat the politics of Dutton and Trump by rolling over. You beat it by holding firm to core principles.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Indi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the Migration Amendment Bill. Many of my constituents deeply care about our international obligations when it comes to people coming to Australia seeking protection. Over my years as the member for Indi, they have continuously urged me to say to Parliament, refugees are welcome here. I'm concerned the bill before us does not send this message. For this and other reasons, I will be opposing it. In speaking to this bill, it's important to be reminded of the context in which it was introduced. It was introduced in response to the High Court's decision to strike down the government's legislation that was passed following their decision in the NZYQ case that the government could not indefinitely detain non-citizens. In response to the NZYQ decision, the government rushed through Parliament legislation that, with the support of the opposition, meant that any person released from indefinite detention must be subject to ankle bracelets and a curfew. I opposed this legislation at the time, in part because I had concerns whether it had a right, whether it would withstand a High Court challenge. It turns out I was right to be concerned, because the High Court then considered the case of YBFZ, an Iranian released following the NZYQ decision, who was subject to these restrictive curfew and ankle bracelet conditions. But like it found with NZYQ, the High Court found that in the case of YBFZ, the government is once again breaching constitutional principles of the separation of powers by imposing punishment on individuals when this is solely within the remit of the courts. Once again, the government have received a High Court decision that doesn't suit them. And once again, they're introducing legislation that seeks to get them out of this problem. I'll address a number of themes in this bill that I have significant concerns about. Firstly, the provisions that are relevant to the NZYQ cohort and the recent High Court decision. Under the bill, the minister can still impose ankle bracelets and curfew conditions, but he must first be satisfied that the imposition of these conditions is necessary to protect the Australian community from serious harm. Now, this is an improvement on the previous legislation, and I very much accept that some of the released individuals may indeed pose a risk to community safety, and we absolutely must respond to this risk. However, Madam Deputy Speaker, legal experts have expressed views that the legislation may not resolve the issue of whether the imposition of the curfew and monitoring conditions are punitive or are reasonably necessary. Constitutional expert Professor Anne Toomey is quoted as saying, "It's fairly likely someone will challenge it, and there is a reasonable chance it will be struck down." So I cannot in good faith support a bill that is unlikely to withstand yet another High Court challenge. It's important to remind ourselves, actually, that every High Court challenge to government legislation costs a significant amount of taxpayer dollars. I must be able to satisfy myself that the legislation I'm voting on has been as protected as much as possible from this occurring. And right now, I cannot assure myself of this in this particular case. I now want to move to the other provisions of the bill that really have nothing to do with NZYQ and YBFZ. First, under the bill, there are now broad powers of the Minister to reverse a protection finding. Just sit with that. This is a deeply concerning issue, with the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre saying that refugees who've been living in our community for years could be exposed to deportation, including people who have Australian citizen family members. Second, the bill provides expansive powers for the Australian government to deport people to unspecified third countries. The Minister says this is about deporting people who have no legal right to be in Australia. I seriously question which people we're talking about. Under the bill, we're not just talking about people that have criminal records. We're potentially talking about a much wider group of people, again, including people that have lived in and contributed to the Australian community for many, many years. It could include people that haven't been found to be owed protection because they've been subject to the extremely flawed fast-track process. Further, under the bill, the government can now pay countries to take people they are deporting to. And this could create a very real risk of a new offshore warehousing program. And if the Australian public want to know how much the government is spending to do this, well, that will only be revealed via Freedom of Information requests or Senate estimates hearings. And I've got real concerns about ensuring the transparency of such use of taxpayer money. Thirdly, I'm concerned about provisions in the bill that give the Commonwealth civil liability immunity. And this goes beyond a long-held principle that the government should be subject to the same liabilities as any individual. The Commonwealth has previously paid significant amounts of compensation for actions that have taken place in regional processing countries. And while the amendments are prospective and do not extinguish claims for conduct that's already occurred, they will, again, make no mistake, they will significantly limit the rights of persons in immigration detention to seek compensation from the Commonwealth in the future. According to recent research conducted by the University of New South Wales, the risk of post-traumatic stress disorder was 20 times higher for people held in offshore detention. But if this bill passes, these people will have no legal rights to ensure the Commonwealth is responsible for causing this harm. Since this bill was introduced, constituents have written to me urging me to oppose it. One constituent said, "This bill is a continuation of the dehumanising treatment of people seeking asylum who, through no fault of their own, are unable to safely return to their own country." Another wrote to me that in this bill, it appears the major parties are competing with each other in their efforts to be the most hard line. And another, both major parties pursue this unconscionable abuse of the world's most vulnerable people for political point scoring. It's confounding. When considering this bill, I'm also reminded of the tireless work of Rural Australians for Refugees, who have chapters right across my electorate of Indi. Through their words, and most importantly through their actions, they've supported refugees through fundraising and sponsorship. Now, I know that many Australians, like these constituents of mine, are compassionate, they're humane. They expect their government to be the same. But with this bill, their expectations are not being met. I urge the government to consider amendments to the bill to ensure it is consistent with their objective of removing serious offenders from Australia, as they have stated, and not just any non-citizens. I also urge the Senate to send this bill to a full inquiry for adequate scrutiny so that we can understand the full impact of these proposed laws. So until I see improvements and understand this impact, I will not be supporting this bill.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Sturt.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And can I start by thoroughly agreeing with the member for Indi that this bill should go to a Senate committee, and that's the position that we've outlined. Of course, the lead speaker, the member for Wannon, made it clear that, in principle, we hope to support this bill if it indeed does what the government claims it will. But regrettably, the government's made these claims before, and this is a subsequent piece of legislation they're bringing into this place 12 months, nearly 12 months after the NZYQ decision was handed down last November. And of course, we still don't have a proper legislative framework in place to deal with dangerous, hardened criminals who are out there reoffending against Australians as we speak. And of course, the November decision of the High Court was thoroughly foreseen by comments by Justice Gleeson months earlier in the High Court, which clearly foreshadowed that there was a risk that this decision would be made, that the High Court would say, go down the path of saying that the current arrangements that are in place to keep detained dangerous people who have had their visas cancelled, some of them child sex offenders, rapists, all sorts of heinous criminals who we don't want in this country, who don't deserve to be in this country, who don't follow the laws of this country, and who are not safe to be on the streets of this country. And of course, regrettably, despite a great deal of warning via Justice Gleeson's commentary months before, the government was completely flat-footed and caught completely by surprise when that decision was handed down, and we immediately had hundreds of people let out onto the streets. And regrettably, and the most tragic episodes in this whole sorry saga of government incompetence are the Australian victims of reoffending of these criminals because they were released by this government. They've tried to claim that they had to do it because of a High Court decision. Well, we happen to be debating a year later legislation that they're claiming will fix this problem. Why weren't we debating it the day this decision was handed down? Why wasn't the now sacked minister on his game, on his brief, and having his department properly preparing this legislation, which now we're told will address the issues of releasing these criminals into Australian society? Why was this bill not ready to go the day in which that decision handed down? Well, it's because of the complete incompetence and uselessness of the now removed minister from that portfolio. Now, this is why we've got a great deal of scepticism and concern in just taking the government for their word on these matters when they say, well, this legislation is going to address these issues. They've said that before and it hasn't. And I concede that other members have made the comment that there are legal scholars making commentary about the risk of this being struck down again by the High Court and having constitutional issues. The previous speaker mentioned that we shouldn't be passing legislation through this chamber when we think it's got risk of being unconstitutional, which is an excellent point, and why people shouldn't have supported the misinformation and disinformation bill going through this parliament, because that's a piece of legislation that's got the highest chance of being struck down by the High Court as being unconstitutional. But thankfully that looks like it's got Buckley's and none of passing the Senate. So we'd like to see a proper Senate inquiry into this legislation, because we're sick of passing legislation that the government says is going to protect Australians that subsequently fails to do so. And there have been innocent Australians that have been victims of these awful criminals that were let back out into the community because of this government's incompetence. And we don't want to see legislation that doesn't achieve what it claims to, which is the track record of this government in this area of policy, again let down the people of this country. and leave them unsafe. And we don't want to look at any more victims on the front page of newspapers with black and blue faces because someone that shouldn't be out on the streets in the Australian community has offended against them because this government can't keep these people where they should be, and that's off the streets and away from innocent Australians. So we are not standing in the way of the passage of this bill through the House of Representatives, and of course, hopefully, there's a first time for everything. The government is right this time when they say that this legislation will address the enormous loopholes that have opened up in letting these awful criminals walk the streets and offend against innocent Australians. But we do need to test this through a Senate inquiry because, as I say, we've been told all this before and been let down by this government making commitments about legislation that was meant to achieve the protection of Australian citizens in our society and failed to do so. So we commend the second reading through the House. We'll be supporting in the Senate a full inquiry into this legislation to properly probe and understand that it is indeed going to do what the government claims it will.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. Just on 12 months ago, the High Court of Australia handed down a unanimous judgment in a case that is now known as the NZYQ case, confirming that detention is a form of punishment and indefinite detention of people is unlawful and unconstitutional. Given Australia's long history of political bipartisanship around the horrendous offshoring of those seeking refuge in our country, the court's finding was welcomed as a watershed moment in Australian legal history. And it could have been a watershed moment for immigration policy and this nation more broadly. It could have been a critical juncture to interrogate the double standards that this country places on citizens compared to non-citizens, brown and black people compared to white. It could have been a moment to reflect on our treatment of non-citizens. Excuse me, Speaker. 11 years after reopening the Australia's offshore processing regime, this could have been an opportunity to ask ourselves, how can we do better? Instead, the NZYQ case saw this government thrown into panic, rushing so-called emergency legislation to reinstate the status quo and bowing to the opposition's political attacks, misleading narrative of community safety. I'm sorry, I'm going to start again, if I may. Sorry. Just on 12 months ago, the High Court of Australia handed down a unanimous judgment in a case that is now known as the NZYQ case, confirming that detention is a form of punishment and indefinite detention of people in this country is unlawful and unconstitutional. Given Australia's long history of political bipartisanship around the offshoring of those seeking refuge in our country, the court's finding was welcomed as a watershed moment in Australian legal history. A moment that should have seen our immigration system called more broadly to account and our government take the opportunity to reconcile itself with over 30 years of significant human rights breaches. Yet rather than use this critical juncture to interrogate the double standards this country places on citizens compared to non-citizens, or to reflect on our treatment of non-citizens, immigrants and refugees, and the way politicians and the media have waged a campaign of relentless demonisation against them, the government, kowtowing to the opposition's political attacks and misleading narratives around the community safety, was thrown into a state of panic and rushed through so-called emergency legislation to reinstate the status quo. And so 11 years after reopening Australia's offshore processing regime, we found ourselves yet again with a government that is determined to legislate its way around a legal finding. When it comes to almost any issue related to immigration in this country, the rhetoric that pours from the mouths of the people on both sides of this parliament is frequently abhorrent and deliberately intended to support the ongoing operation of an egregious system that suits a political duopoly determined to frighten the masses into submission. The laws then introduced in response to the NZYQ case again attempt to criminalise and control people released from indefinite detention, forcing them to wear ankle monitors and follow curfews. And here we are again, with the High Court just last week ruling these conditions are also an unlawful form of extrajudicial collective punishment. Now, I know we shouldn't be surprised then that rather than accept the legal finding of the High Court, we are yet again here debating a government's rushed attempt to ensure they can continue to impose their own political will rather than abide by international law. But this bill not only seeks to reinstate monitoring conditions, including ankle monitoring and curfews, it also introduces sweeping power to deport thousands of people. According to the Caldor Centre for International Refugee Law, this bill would allow the government to send more people to third countries, give the government sweeping immunity from being sued by people harmed when deported, allow it to revisit protection findings, meaning people previously found to be refugees could be returned to their home country, and impose harsh visa conditions for those who do stay. To be clear, the safety of the community should always be top of mind. As such, this nation urgently needs stronger measures to address violence both broadly and specifically against women. But we must not lose sight of the human rights considerations. We need sustainable long-term solutions, not reactive and rushed responses that feed off fear, equate foreign bodies with criminality, danger and distrust, and ultimately embed inequity, continuing to support an us versus them mindset. The way we protect the community from the risk of individuals who have committed serious violence or sexual offences should be the same, whether those people are citizens or not. With all of that said, the fact of the matter is this bill uses the latest High Court finding to go even further, introducing wide-ranging powers. It creates powers for the minister and other officials to collect or share details of a person's criminal history, including sharing that information with foreign countries. And to be clear, this is illegal. In fact, the bill overrides the state and territory laws that make it illegal and validates any unlawful sharing of information that may have little to no relevance to the current situation, as the offence may have been committed in the distant past. So while the government pats itself on the back for recently reforming privacy protection, it is at the same time granting itself the powers to invade the privacy of non-citizens. Additionally, the bill enables the government to enter arrangements with foreign countries that sees us pay them to accept deported bridging visa R holders. Under this system, the person's bridging visa R would automatically be cancelled as soon as they have permission to enter and remain in a third country. In context, there are more than 200 people in Australia on BVRs, many of whom were released from detention following the High Court's decision. Yet for this arrangement to be pursued by the government, there is no requirement to prove these individuals pose a risk to the community. There's no requirement for a person to have any permanent right to reside in the country they are sent to. There's no guarantee of their safety. And in fact, the third country could legally detain people or even return them to their home countries to face serious harm or persecution. All of this conveniently paid for from our public purse. We know how horrific the conditions in detention centres like Nauru and Manus have been. In fact, Bethlehem Tebahu, a human rights activist and former refugee in Nauru, described it as a place with no privacy, no safety. She lamented the fact she could not see her family and she had no hope for the future. While another former detainee declared, and I quote, "It's not offshore detention, it's not a processing centre, it's a suicide centre." A recent study found that refugees detained offshore for any amount of time face a 20 times greater risk of PTSD and other mental health problems compared with asylum seekers who were detained onshore for less than 6 months. Ultimately, as someone who has long argued for our nation to not only abide and uphold but champion international humanitarian law, myself and my community firmly believe Australia's laws should leave no room for the possibility of prolonged detention here or offshore. That is why I moved a private member's bill last year to limit immigration detention to 90 days, and why I continue to call for an end to this inhumane practice. I recently spoke to a group of refugees who have been failed by the government's fast-track system. One of them, Milad Makvani, fled Iran 12 years ago to escape from an oppressive regime that puts its citizens' lives at risk. He's worked as a truck mechanic since coming to Australia, paid his taxes and employed others. But despite his contribution to the community, his asylum application has been rejected several times, and he is still awaiting the decision of the federal court. People like Milad deserve to be given a clear pathway to permanent residency. But instead, many on bridging visas fear they could have their visas cancelled or not renewed at any moment, and under this new legislation they could even be transferred to a BVR, leaving them vulnerable to deportation to a third country where they could suffer detention or other harms. Even if the government doesn't intend to use these powers against people like Milad, the fact is this bill makes it possible. The bill also grants powers to revisit and overturn protection findings for removal pathway non-citizens. The definition of this group would initially apply to refugees on certain bridging visas, but could also be extended to other visa classes in the future, threatening people who have been living in our communities for years. Refugee status should be durable and lasting, and not open to reversal at a government's whim. To add insult to injury, the bill contains measures that would give the government and immigration officials immunity from civil liability for their actions in deporting people. To be clear, these provisions protect the government against accountability for the harm that people suffer when they're sent offshore. That means, for example, that if someone was sent to Nauru and was assaulted, they would have no recourse to hold our government to account. People held in offshore detention have very limited options to have their voices heard, and legal rights tested with one of the few paths available to them being the tort law system. As a consequence, refugees have rightly used tort law to hold our government to account for damages and breaches of duty of care. This includes the largest human rights settlement to date, which happened in 2017, between Manus Island detainees and the federal government following claims of negligence and unlawful detention. In addition to this, dozens of refugees have secured court orders to be brought to Australia to access urgent life-saving treatment unavailable on Nauru or Manus Island. I've heard from legal practitioners in this area about cases where a former minister had refused to act on medical advice to bring people to Australia who were at serious risk of death. Civil liability claims were often the only way to secure these people's transfer to Australia, where they received the medical care they needed. Many were hospitalised, not just for weeks, but for months after they were transferred, and many are still ill now. Human rights organisations have warned that the provisions in this bill would close the door to these pathways for legal recourse and even necessary medical care. And it's telling that the government feels the need to ensure immunity from being sued by people harmed when deported. And I can't help but feel the government is the last public entity I would ever want to give complete immunity to. Ultimately, this legislation raises a number of human rights issues, with the bill's own statement on compatibility of human rights referencing infringements against the rights to liberty and freedom from arbitrary detention, the right to an effective remedy, rights relating to equality and discrimination, and many more in this bill. The statement of compatibility with human rights also explicitly mentions Australia's obligations arising from the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, of which Article 3 states that, and I quote, "No state shall expel, return or extradite a person to another state where there are substantial grounds for believing they would be in danger of being subjected to torture." It is frankly astonishing to read this passage being used in referencing a bill that the government is trying to rush through this House. In fact, many of the other rights listed, from privacy to equal treatment, would be equally trampled by this legislation. The conclusion of this statement of compatibility says that to the extent that the measures in these amendments limit human rights, they do so in order to maintain the integrity of the migration system and protect the safety of Australian community. But numerous human rights and refugee law experts and my community of North Sydney would argue otherwise. The measures contained in this bill must be thoroughly examined and debated to ensure Australia's immigration policies are just, humane and legal, an ambition that we would have to say is well beyond our reach in the current circumstances. While it's good to see this bill being referred to the Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs Legislative Committee, it is unreasonable to expect that committee to report back on it within just 1 week, given the substance and potential ramifications of this bill and the current workload of this parliament. This bill deserves proper scrutiny. This government needs to be held to account. Ultimately, let's be clear, we need real, long-term solutions for the challenges we face as a nation when it comes to managing migration. And I fear that those things are not contained in this legislation, and I am almost certain that a parliament 12 months from now will be back on its feet debating yet more flawed legislation which will result from the court challenges to this latest iteration, and our community deserves better.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Wentworth.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The first priority of this parliament is keeping the community safe. I acknowledge the community's deep concern about the release of detainees from the NZYQ cohort following the High Court's decision on indefinite detention last year. I share that concern. It's absolutely appropriate for this House to take steps to protect the public from those who've committed very serious crimes in the past and those who may pose a risk to the public in the future. A few of the provisions in this bill go to this kind of community protection, but most do not. And it is those that do not that I would like to focus my comments. Deputy Speaker, having consulted with legal experts and refugee advocates, I have 3 key concerns with this bill. First, this bill contains very broad powers, which go far beyond the scope of dealing with the people in the NZYQ cohort who've committed serious and violent crimes. The bill creates new powers to forcibly depart a very broad range of non-citizens to unspecified third countries without the need to show they pose a risk to the Australian people. Non-citizens could be put in detention in Australia until such time as they can be deported. I understand that this could include refugee and people seeking asylum who have lived in and contributed to our community for years. And so, understandably, I've been told that this bill is causing widespread concern amongst affected communities. I'm particularly concerned by the potential impact on people who've been failed by the so-called fast-track process. These people arrived in Australia over a decade ago, and many were genuine refugees whose claims were never properly assessed. Labor has admitted the fast-track process was neither fast nor fair, abolishing the process and the body that administered it. I have met numerous people in this cohort, numerous honest, hard-working, compassionate people who've been stuck in limbo for over a decade and just want to build their lives. Yet feedback I've received from refugee law experts is that those failed by fast-track could be subject to the deportation arrangements in this bill. And I want to share the story of one of them, which has been provided to me by the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre. Geetha fled Sri Lanka and applied for a protection visa. She was subjected to this fast-track process and her protection application was refused by the Department and Immigration Assessment Authority without a fair opportunity to present her protection claims, which included experiences of severe gender-based violence. After years in the courts, Geetha had sought ministerial intervention in order to lodge a new protection visa application and to raise her gender-based violence protection claims. Geetha has been granted a 6-month BVE on departure grounds, while she waits her ministerial intervention request outcome. If the bill is passed, once Geetha BVE expires, she would be exposed to detention and deportation to a third country, including Sri Lanka, from where she fled gender-based violence. Beyond people like Geetha, I'm also concerned about others who may be unfairly affected, including those who have compassionate or compelling reasons to remain in Australia, like being married to an Australian citizen or having Australian children. Surely good reasons for you to stay in this country. Given the delays in visa processing, many of those people have been living in Australia for years and have laid down roots here. Now, I accept the Minister's argument that Australia should have the mechanism to remove people who do not have the right to be here and who have a safe place they can go instead. I absolutely accept that. If an unlawful non-citizen without family in Australia is offered a safe place to live in New Zealand, it is perfectly reasonable for them to be made to take it. But if a refugee failed by the fast-track system who has lived in Australia for a decade and has a partner and child here is being forcibly deported to Nauru, where they may be detained indefinitely with no rights, that's a very different situation. And that is the two extremes that we are contending with in this bill. And the nature of the third country deportation arrangements is my second key concern. Whilst we all hope Australia would only enter into third country agreements with countries such as New Zealand or Canada, with strong social safety nets and respect for the rights of refugees and individuals, there are no guarantees in this bill. The government has not provided clear information about which countries it plans to enter third country arrangements with, or with the rights that people will have once they arrive. This has led legal experts to raise concerns that this bill could allow for people to be held in foreign countries with no safeguards to ensure they are treated humanely, all out of the Australian taxpayers' expense. They could be detained in places like Nauru, potentially indefinitely, and nothing in the bill requires that a lasting solution for them is found. The harms of Australia's offshore regime on Nauru and Manus Islands are well documented, as is the huge cost to Australian taxpayers. And this brings me to my third concern, which relates to the lack of transparency and accountability in this bill. As the member for Indi rightly pointed out, there are no requirements for this bill to publish how much Australia is paying to third countries to accept the people that we're deporting. I understand there are not even new requirements to publish how many people we are deporting and which countries they are going to. In an area where past Australian governments have a very checkered history when it comes to the morality of their actions, as well as the value for money of offshore arrangements, it is vital that there is transparency over how these new provisions are being applied. The bill also attempts to stop the government from being sued for any actions it takes to remove people from Australia or for their subsequent treatment in a third country. This route may remove an important accountability mechanism for those transferred offshore, like the dozens of refugees who secured court orders to be brought into Australia to access urgent, life-saving treatment unavailable on Nauru or Manus Island. By shutting the door to future legal challenges, I'm concerned that the government would effectively remove one of the few proven checks on its power in this area. Deputy Speaker, these are complex issues, and there are no easy answers. The bill has come about in part because the government's previous attempts to respond to the High Court's NZYQ decision have been rushed, poorly thought through, and gave limited opportunity for parliamentary scrutiny. In the end, the High Court found this Parliament's rushed attempts to paper over the cracks in Australia's migration laws were unconstitutional, the possibility of which was pointed out by the crossbench on numerous occasions during the debate. If we had asylum processes that were both fair and efficient, if there were safeguards ensuring that safety and the rights of people in place for the countries we were sending them to, and if we had more transparency over the arrangements proposed in this bill, I would be more willing to accept the Minister's assertion that there is no reason why non-citizens without a visa should be allowed to stay in Australia. But history has shown that that's not the case, particularly when it comes to those failed fast-tracked visa holders. So I have major concerns with this bill, and I believe it warrants further legislative scrutiny. The government has already made regulations which the Minister has stated allow him to continue to use curfews and electronic monitoring devices on the NZYQ cohort, and so there does not seem to be any urgent reason to pass this legislation today. I urge the government to refer the bill for an inquiry and await the inquiry's report before attempting to pass it in either the House or the Senate. Thank you.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The saying goes that history repeats itself, and this is certainly the case with the ongoing back and forth between the High Court and the Executive that's unfolded over the course of the past year, the latest iteration of which is this Migration Amendment Bill. And while the High Court's actions reflect the separation of powers working as intended, the government's repeated attempts to thwart the court's intentions with patchwork legislation is concerning. In late 2023, the High Court's NZYQ decision on the illegality of indefinite detention provoked a wave of bills to manage the criminal and political risk of the cohort of potentially dangerous individuals being released into the community. Community safety is critically important. There is absolutely no argument about that. And the release of potentially dangerous and violent offenders, sexual predators and others into our communities absolutely requires a response, and in some cases, targeted deportation may be warranted. However, the cohort of individuals affected by the High Court's decision-making is not homogenous. These people are not all the same, and imposing a one-size-fits-all approach to them is therefore flawed. Indeed, this bill captures people who should not be caught in it, and goes far beyond the NZYQ group. All of these bills have been complex and they've been rushed. In many cases, they've not undergone proper committee or external consultation, and many of their key provisions are the result of deals between the major parties, which I would argue in some cases have been politically motivated. Over 2 decades on since Australia began sending refugees and asylum seekers offshore, our nation is still living with the stain of offshore detention on our national character. Humanity should be at the centre of any conversation about war and its consequences, and this principle must be the starting point for policy making on migration and refugees. Indeed, Australia's conversation and history of policy in this space has been a fraught one which has not lived up to these ideals. I think that's obvious. Punishment is a matter for the courts, not any minister. Most refugees and asylum seekers are no threat to Australia, and they deserve to be treated with dignity, respect and compassion. These are core principles which should guide Australian migration policy, and indeed principles which I've spoken to on each of the bills the government has introduced to manage the NZYQ decision. Last century, Australia provided a home for those fleeing wars across Southeast Asia, including those who fled the Vietnam War and the horrors of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. We welcomed people from war-torn Sudan, Syria and Afghanistan. We provided a safe haven for the highest concentration of Holocaust survivors in the world, and they and their descendants now call Melbourne and Sydney home. But our national conversation on refugees and asylum seekers this century has been horrible and has again turned, indeed degenerated, in just the past year, including rhetoric in recent months over visas for Gazan refugees and echoes of Donald Trump's toxic Muslim ban of 2017. I will say that we must not follow the path of the US on refugees and migration. Following the American people's decision on November 8 and the President-elect's stated policies of mass deportation, this is perhaps more important now than it ever has been. But the Migration Amendment Bill 2024 debate does not reflect this sentiment. Indeed, it represents a broadening of the executive's power and goes well beyond the scope of NZYQ. The Human Rights Law Centre says it could apply to refugees and asylum seekers holding temporary visas, including those who've lived in Australia for years. These individuals have deep roots in our communities. It risks creating a system of deportation where decisions are made not based on due process, but on politics. And the bill provides immunity for the government managing that system, even if people are being deported to environments where there are known risks of harm. I reflect on the case of one of my constituents in Goldstein, currently on a temporary visa. This constituent is a father, a business owner, a taxpayer, an employer. This individual's been in a state of legal limbo for 12 years and lives under a cloud of uncertainty in relation to his ability to remain in our community. His wife was a refugee who's been granted Australian permanent citizenship. They have a child born in Australia. What is the outlook for this family under this legislation? Is this man, who is Iranian, facing deportation to a third country? This legislation exacerbates the anxieties felt by many like this across the nation. This is particularly the case for those who've been subjected to the appalling fast-track program for more than a decade and remain in ongoing limbo with limited rights to work, study and healthcare. I have met many of these hardworking people, some just yesterday, and they do not deserve this torture. This bill would provide the government with unprecedented powers, including the ability to overturn protection pathways and deport people, uproot them from their families and communities to third countries via so-called reception arrangements. Deportation, regardless of the risks they individually may face at their destination, or even the risks these individuals may pose themselves to the communities that live there if they do have a criminal history. This is not a theoretical scenario. The government refuses to specify which third countries it may negotiate with or intends to reach agreement with. I note the concerns of the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre that this may represent a continuation or escalation of the offshore detention policy by stealth. The government has not ruled out that the third country could be Nauru, for example, and the bill does not rule out deportation to third countries that are not a signatory to the International Refugee Convention. It is entirely conceivable that an individual could be deported to a third country where they face persecution, discrimination and serious harm. It grants the Minister authority to overturn protection findings, permits the government to share personal information with foreign entities and to withhold it from the Australian public. Only indirect transparency measures apply. The public, apparently, must rely on Senate estimates and freedom of information requests for insight into the government's deportation arrangements, or at least that's what the Minister has told me. The legislation, as I've said, grants immunity to Commonwealth officers from civil claims related to harm caused during deportation processes, shielding government actions from proper legal scrutiny. The High Court has repeatedly affirmed that the punitive measures of ankle bracelets and strict curfews represent executive overreach and are unconstitutional. The reintroduction of these measures in this legislation is a blatant attempt to circumvent the decision of the High Court. Rather than respecting the High Court's repeated affirmations, the government is once again seeking to undermine them. This behaviour, arguably, risks eroding the judiciary's independence and also public trust. As I forewarned 12 months ago during the last iteration of this process, this legislation just sets the stage for yet another High Court legal contest. And again now, as constitutional expert Anne Toomey says, quote, "It's fairly likely someone will challenge it and there's a reasonable chance it will be struck down." Deputy Speaker, we must engage in meaningful consultation with legal experts, human rights advocates and affected communities to create policies that reflect our national character and ethical responsibilities. National security and compassion are not a zero-sum game. We can govern with humanity as the guiding principle of migration policy. Indeed, we must. I've had many emails from constituents opposing this bill. Here's one. Will you publicly oppose this bill as it is inhumane? We need to deal with this complex problem with a lot more understanding and compassion. Would you kindly let me know your thoughts and intentions? Thank you for writing. Yes, I will let you know that I will not be supporting this bill in its current form. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the Minister.
Thanks, Speaker. I wish to point out to the House that the individuals that will be subject to this bill generally have very serious and/or lengthy criminal records, and their visa cancellations have been determined based on the national interest and the expectations of the Australian community. In almost all cases, before a person's visa is cancelled, they are issued with a warning letter. And for many of these individuals, they are issued with several warning letters, not one, but 2 or 3 or 4, before the decision is made to cancel a visa. In all cases, people are offered procedural fairness, the opportunity to respond to a prospective cancellation of their visa. So we are talking here about individuals who have committed serious crimes, and it is the expectation of the Australian community that they no longer be able to hold a visa, a valid visa here in Australia. So it must be recognised that we need a robust legislative framework that allows us to manage the migration system in the interests of the Australian people, and most importantly, meeting the expectations of the Australian people about keeping Australians safe. There is no more important element of the system than decisions on who may come to Australia, who may hold visas whilst they are in Australia, and who has to leave. There's an ongoing problem that Australia faces in sending home individuals who will not cooperate with the department's removal efforts. Some of these people are in immigration detention and some are in the community on temporary bridging visas. In addition, there's a group of countries that will not accept individuals who are citizens of their country if that person has indicated they do not agree to go home. There are other countries who are very reluctant to receive their own citizens returning from Australia. This bill creates a ceasing event so that a bridging visa removal pending ceases once permission is obtained from another country for the holder to travel to and remain in that other country, and notification of grant of that permission or authority has been given. This will allow us to negotiate agreements with third countries about acceptance of non-citizens who have exhausted all avenues to stay in Australia but who cannot be removed to their home country. I can confirm that Australia does not return individuals to countries in respect of which they have been found to engage Australia's non-refoulement obligations. And that is an important point to make. That non-refoulement obligation will not change under this bill. However, persons who have found not to engage Australia's non-refoulement obligations and who have exhausted all avenues for appeal, have no lawful basis for remaining in Australia, and we need to use all our tools and levers to remove them from this country. Further, the bill provides that disclosure of personal information to foreign countries may be made in support of determining whether any non-citizens may be removed, except where Australia's protection obligations are in play. This bill also includes amendments that would clarify that officers under the Migration Act and the Community Protection Board may continue to take into account spent convictions when making decisions or recommendations on community protection or character-related matters. The bill also includes amendments to ensure that sufficient legislative authority is in place to support and authorise spending on third country resettlement, and that Commonwealth action in relation to third country resettlement, should that be required. The various provisions in the amending bill are necessary for maintaining a robust and effective removal program for those who have no right to remain in Australia but can no longer be detained. This bill sends a very strong signal, Speaker, about Australia's intentions and expectations of cooperation with removal efforts and reinforces the integrity of the overall immigration system. But most importantly, it is about ensuring that we are maintaining the safety of the Australian population, which is certainly what they expect from their government, and I commend the bill to the chamber.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. As it is necessary to resolve this question to enable further questions to be considered in relation to this bill, in accordance with Standing Order 195, the bill will be returned to the House for further consideration. And I call the clerk.
Government Business Order of the Day number 2, Sydney Airport Demand Management Amendment Bill 2024, resumption of debate on the second reading.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Cowper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, I'm pleased to rise today to speak on the Sydney Airport Demand Management Amendment Bill and the need for the right adjustments to be made as quickly as possible, not just for the people of Australia, but particularly for the people in my electorate of Cowper. I'm very proud to represent a coastal regional electorate that is growing at an exponential rate. As someone who was born and raised there and now raising my own family, I have personally witnessed the ever-expanding list of reasons why the mid-north coast of New South Wales is so attractive to metro migrants, regional sea changers, retirees and tourists alike. We are a region overflowing with natural beauty, from stunning beaches to our rivers, mountains and forests, and in recent decades our livability credentials have expanded to include better healthcare infrastructure, world-class community hubs and sporting facilities, a wide range of schools and tertiary education options, and importantly, increased access to job opportunities, which have radically enhanced since COVID. Part of this expansion in opportunity has been a direct result of our airports in Port Macquarie and Coffs Harbour and the ability to travel to Sydney or Brisbane on a 1-hour flight. Since COVID, the demand on our local airports has increased month on month. Unfortunately, the competitive landscape has declined over that same period, resulting in airfare charges that have become untenable for many people. In Coffs Harbour, people are now resorting to driving over 2 hours north to Ballina in order to take advantages of airfares that are a third of the price that are offered locally. Even when you factor in petrol and parking costs.
Order. Division has been called for in the House. The proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division. The proceedings will resume when the Chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or subsequent divisions. question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Cowper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was saying just before the break that right now people in Coffs Harbour, because of the systems that have been put in place and the imbalance, are now travelling 2 hours to Ballina, which is over 2 hours north, to take advantage of airfares that are a third of the price that are offered locally. So they're travelling to Coffs Harbour to fly to Sydney instead of flying from Coffs Harbour down to Sydney, because the prices are $200, $250 as opposed to $600 odd because of competition. It doesn't make much sense when Coffs Harbour is a regional city of almost 100,000 people with an established airport that can in fact take aircraft that can fly internationally. It just beggars belief that available fares from a city half the size and hundreds of kilometres away can be cheaper to fly to Sydney. For regional towns and cities, our transport networks are critical. There is a need and an expectation that these grow with the population and the demand, but unfortunately for the Mid-North Coast, we have seen the opposite occur. Our supply has dwindled, pushing up prices as much as 300% on what we are seeing from 2019 when I was first elected. I received daily correspondence from a wide section of the community lamenting this fact, and it's fair enough too. It makes absolutely no sense. There are those in aged care facilities and on home care packages and families who are no longer able to visit because of the cost of these flights. Local businesses that rely on the seasonal influx of tourists have seen a drop in revenue because of the prices to the destination. And of course there are students who came to our region to study at Charles Sturt University or Southern Cross University, who are now feeling extremely isolated from their families who might live in Sydney or Melbourne. And of course it's those fly-in, fly-out FIFO workers who do go to Sydney, who do choose to go to Melbourne, who prior to the pandemic made a decision to come to our regions because the flights were available and they were cheap, well, they were affordable. Now it's almost impossible for them to travel on a weekly basis, and I do know that in some cases it has ended up that these people are no longer in employment because of the fact that they cannot pay those fares to travel to Sydney, Melbourne or Brisbane from Port Macquarie or Coffs Harbour. One of the notable problems is the slot allocation inefficiencies at the Sydney Airport. And I'd like to make the point that the company that manages the slot allocation, and I'll make a declaration here, I do have a Chairman's Club Lounge membership. I'll make that declaration. But that doesn't stop me from being critical of Qantas, just like I'm a client or a customer of the Commonwealth Bank, and I'm constantly criticising them. So I will continue to do my job on behalf of my constituents. But I'll make this point. The company that allocates the slot allocations for Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane, the Sydney Allocation Corporation, 46% of that company is owned by Qantas, and 37, I'll be corrected, but it's in the 30s, is owned by Virgin. Now that is letting the fox run the hen house. It really is. It is outrageous, and I find it entirely unacceptable that Qantas and Virgin have a monopoly over the slot allocation of flights where you see them not use those slots in a predatory fashion to push out smaller airlines. And that is exactly what we've seen in Port Macquarie and Coffs Harbour. We have had Bonza, Bonza were trying to go to different routes, but of course they still need a cash flow. Bonza were pushed out because of lack of slot allocation. We had Fly Pelican, which it was fantastic. It only flew on a Thursday and a Sunday. Flew from Port Macquarie direct to Canberra, Canberra direct to Port Macquarie, other locations. They're no longer with us because it was not financially viable for them because of the slot allocations. And now we have seen Rex similarly, and Rex is so important for regional and rural areas because they service the people that Qantas and Virgin consider a byproduct. Rex, as we all know, is in voluntary administration. Hopefully we see them back with some sort of government intervention. But the fact that Qantas and Virgin can actually continue on with this predatory practice needs to be stopped, and it needs to be stopped right now. And not just for the reason that it's a predatory practice, but because it affects people in the regions. And Port Macquarie and Coffs Harbour are classic examples of that. But Deputy Speaker, if I can go to the bill itself. The bill seeks to introduce a new recovery framework which is intended to limit delays, cancellations and redirection of the flights that occur during significant weather events in the Sydney airport space, a framework that the Coalition wholeheartedly supports. It is hoped that under this framework there would be capacity to operate an additional 5 flights above the hourly cap for a limited 2-hour recovery period following a declared significant event. The bill also seeks to improve the governance of the Slot Compliance Committee. We certainly hope that happens. Harmonise the rules underpinning the demand management scheme with the internationally recognised World Airport Slot Guidelines. It provides the Minister with the ability to determine the demand management scheme and provide directions to the slot manager. Deputy Speaker, while the detail will be covered in the proposed regulations, it's critical that improvements to the Sydney Airport Demand Management Scheme are effective at addressing long-standing concerns about slot allocation and compliance at Sydney Airport to ensure good performance by airlines is rewarded, anti-competitive behaviour is prevented, and new entrants are able to get access on fair and reasonable terms. We will look to the Senate, Deputy Speaker, in their inquiry to see what extent the bill addresses the productivity and competitive challenges measured against the recommendations of the Harris Review. And we feel that this is necessary given the lack of effective community consultation that has been undertaken to date and the fact that the regulations have not yet been formally drafted. Deputy Speaker, the Coalition wants to see more affordable and reliable competitive aviation sector. And I say the Coalition, but I honestly believe that everybody in this place wants to see a more affordable, reliable and competitive aviation sector. And with that in mind, we do have concerns and issues in relation to the government's bill, which we believe should be raised and examined through the Senate inquiry process. At the end of the day, all Australians want and deserve an aviation industry that not only gets the basics right, but is also accessible and available for everyone. We need planes to take off and land on time. We need choices when it comes to carriers. We need choices where it comes to routes, and we need airfares that are stable and affordable. And without this, regions like Port Macquarie, Coffs Harbour, Kempsey and all the way in between won't prosper. It's as simple as that. The inquiry process will inform the Coalition's final position on the government's bill, but I do reiterate that we do support the intent and the goals herein, and all of our constituents deserve our full attention and support in relation to safeguards in this critical transport link for now and for years to come. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Ryan.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. I move the amendment as circulated in my name as follows: that all the words after that be omitted with a view to substituting the following words. The House, 1, notes that A, the Sydney Airport Demand Management Act 1997 imposes an 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. curfew and 80 per hour movement cap at Sydney Airport, protecting the inner Sydney community from the worst effects of aircraft noise, and B, other airports around Australia, including Brisbane, Melbourne and the soon-to-be-opened Western Sydney International Airport, are not subject to an equivalent regime, and 2, calls on the government to consider whether an equivalent movement cap and curfew scheme should be applied to other airports in Australia. For nearly 3 decades, Sydney residents have enjoyed the protection of a flight movement cap of 80 per hour and a curfew from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. Obviously, this isn't a perfect solution, as inner Sydney residents are still subject to substantial aircraft noise, but the curfew provides important protection against the worst health effect of aircraft noise, and that is disturbed sleep, and the movement cap provides certainty about the maximum levels that are possible during the day. While this legislation makes slight changes to the movement cap in certain circumstances, the Greens are actually pleased to see that calls from the aviation industry to substantially weaken the movement cap and the curfew have been resisted. The real question then is, when the government is taking such care to preserve the substance of the movement cap in Sydney, why are they so resistant to new movement caps at other airports around the country? Western Sydney International Airport is due to open in 2026. No curfew, no movement cap. Western Sydney and Blue Mountains residents are being treated like second-class citizens compared to their inner city Sydney neighbours. The Transport Minister has recently approved the third runway at Melbourne Tullamarine Airport. That airport has never had a curfew or movement cap, and that's despite the lack of an overwater option like Sydney and like Brisbane. Indeed, aircraft noise is being dumped on the residents of Western and inner Melbourne. We learned at the recent Senate inquiry hearing that the Transport Minister ignored an independent health assessment showing developmental delays of up to 6 months in children as a result of Melbourne's third runway. She ignored that study, sadly, instead relying on the one conducted by the airport itself. Hardly independent, I would argue. Then we have Brisbane, where calls for a movement cap and curfew have been strongly resisted by the government, the airlines and the Brisbane Airport Corporation. The botched community engagement prior to the opening of the second runway there misled people to believe aircraft noise would decrease over the city, Deputy Speaker. Instead, the exact opposite happened. And it's not just disturbed sleep, it's the long-term mental and physical health effects that come from increased levels of noise. These are not trivial. They are very well documented. Brisbane residents have a very simple ask: a movement cap and a curfew. Like Sydney's, I don't think that's too much to ask. Instead, residents have sort of been mocked and dismissed by politicians from both major parties, by the airport and by the aviation industry. The Greens, backed by the community, have had some important wins on this, including establishing the Senate inquiry and the ministerial direction to make sod props, which is the best operating mode at the airport for noise reduction, the preferred mode at all hours at Brisbane Airport, and that's going to be coming in at the end of November. But these measures will only go so far, as Brisbane Airport is on track to double the number of flights by 2035. That means sod props mode can't be used as often, and it means more noise over people's homes, more disturbed sleep and more adverse health effects. Sydney gets this special treatment, which we argue should be universal across the country. Everyone deserves it, while elsewhere people's health is being sacrificed to the profits of the aviation industry. It's got to stop. The government must take implementation of movement caps and curfews at airports like Brisbane seriously. Labor and the previous LNP government have effectively encouraged monopolies and duopolies in Australia by refusing to step in and hold big corporations to account. We've seen it with Coles and Woolworths, the big four banks, and now we're seeing it in aviation, sadly, where Qantas and Virgin are bullying the competition through a practice called slot hoarding, as the previous speaker mentioned. Slot allocation might seem like an abstract concept, but it impacts every traveller. Here's what it means. Big airlines like Qantas book up far more slots than they need, then repeatedly cancel these flights. Frustrated passengers buy tickets for flights that these airlines know won't even leave the ground. Last year alone, the ACCC alleged Qantas cancelled 15,000 flights for this very reason. And to make matters worse, the slot management organisation that oversees Sydney Airport slot allocations, again as the previous speaker mentioned, is majority owned by Qantas and Virgin. A complete conflict of interest. Qantas and Virgin shouldn't be selling themselves slots. You know, it shouldn't be hard to rule out airlines holding a full or partial shareholding in the slot manager. This is problematic for everyday Australians. New entrants like Rex and Bonza are shut out, unable to access the slots they need to establish viable routes, as the previous speaker mentioned, to the regions in particular. That means fewer choices and higher costs for Australians, especially in those regional areas. People pay more, often to find that the flights they booked may not even exist. Merely tinkering around the edges with slots reform will not fix the fundamental issues with the Australian aviation industry, that it's a highly concentrated, monopolised market that pursues corporate profit over communities, customers and workers. This week, we've seen just how eager airlines are to offer freebies to politicians who keep their interests safe. The perks flow both ways, and the LNP government's actions during the pandemic are a perfect example of this cosy relationship. Under Morrison's government, Qantas received a staggering $2.7 billion in taxpayer subsidies, money that, by the way, has never been repaid. While millions of Australians were doing it tough, Qantas got a free lifeline to the tune of billions of dollars of your tax money. How did Qantas repay that generosity? They fired 10,000 workers in the middle of a pandemic, including 1,700 illegally, as found by the High Court. This is a clear and shameful indictment of the state of our aviation sector and a reminder of successive governments' truly lame responses to corporate wrongdoing. To further rub salt in the wound, Qantas brought forward their losses from the pandemic and paid no income tax last financial year, zero, despite posting a record $2.47 billion profit. No income tax. It's completely rigged against us. Nurses who are at their breaking point, stretched to their absolute limits and actually risking their lives during the pandemic, paid more income tax than Qantas and Virgin. It's absolutely insulting. Australians have had enough of a system that rewards bad behaviour and gives massive handouts to corporations who need it the least. When politicians are getting all of these freebies, it's completely understandable for people to be questioning Qantas's relationship with the very same MPs and ministers that regulate them. Ultimately, this bill represents more of the same. Performative aviation industry reform with some piecemeal changes to a system that fundamentally undermines the real interests of our communities. The Greens will support the passage of this bill through the House, and we will reserve our position in the Senate. Thank you.
Is the amendment seconded?
Yes, I second the amendment.
Do you want to reserve your right to speak?
No, I'd like to give a speech as well, please.
Okay. Member for Brisbane.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Back in the 70s, the International Air Transport Association, or IATA, came up with an airline slot system to reduce airport congestion. The initial aim was to regulate and improve the air traffic flow during busy travel times at busy airports. Some airports in Australia fall into the category this system regulates. It's supposed to be a use-it-or-lose-it system, where airlines have to use their slots at least 80% of the time or they become available to other airlines. But over time, we've seen airlines manipulate the system by slot hoarding. This is a practice where airlines schedule a flight, then cancel closer to the date of departure. This makes it look like they're using their allocated slots so that they don't lose them. It's anti-competitive, keeps competition out and keeps fares higher. It's also incredibly frustrating for customers because they are having constant schedule changes and cancellations of their flights. We absolutely need to reform slot compliance and enforcement and make transparency mandatory. We cannot have a system where slots are hoarded by airlines and managed by airlines. It makes zero sense. But let's zoom out for a moment, as there is so much more that needs to be done to fix the root issues with the aviation industry in Australia. It's a highly monopolised, highly concentrated market. The likes of Qantas and Virgin are after corporate profit, while consumers, workers and communities take a back seat. Now, during the previous government, the Liberals and Nationals gave $2.7 billion in taxpayer subsidies to Qantas, and in exchange, what did Qantas do? Well, they fired 10,000 workers, and the High Court found that 1,700 of those workers were fired illegally. Now, we fast forward to the 22-2023 financial year, and Qantas recorded a record profit of $2.47 billion. They paid no income tax, and of course they've made no mention of repaying any of the billions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies that the coalition handed out to them. If we are going to hand over that volume of money to private companies, the very least we should get in return is a stake in them. This bill makes changes to the slot regime at Sydney Airport to ensure viability of operations. Now, it also works alongside the Sydney Airport Demand Management Act, which imposes an 11 p.m. to a 6 a.m. curfew, as well as hourly caps on aircraft movements. It's not a perfect setup, but inner Sydney will remain protected from the worst of flight noise by the curfew and by these caps. Excessive noise pollution has serious health impacts. So much so that an independent health assessment into the third runway at Melbourne's Tullamarine Airport showed potential 6-month developmental delays in children due to excessive aircraft noise. So this bill once again raises the question, why is such a scheme good enough for the Prime Minister's electorate in Sydney, but not good enough for our community in Brisbane, or for Melbourne, or for Western Sydney? I've met with countless constituents that are seriously impacted by flight noise, especially with the long-haul heavy flights that land and take off at Brisbane in the middle of the night. I encourage the Labor government to vote with the Greens to pass our amendment to ensure that our Brisbane community have these same protections that are afforded to communities in Sydney.
The original question was that this bill be now read a second time. To this, the honourable member for Ryan has moved as an amendment that all words after that be omitted with a view to substituting other words. The question now is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Griffith.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. This bill is an attempt to reform the slot management at Sydney Airport following extensive criticism of the current system. It's an amendment to the original legislation that put in a cap and curfew at Sydney Airport. Sydney communities fought hard to get that cap and curfew in the 1990s. They're not perfect, but they are effective and they protect Sydney residents from the worst of flight noise from their airport. But we see now the government preserving and protecting the cap and curfew at Sydney Airport, and the Greens have moved an amendment calling on the government to consider a cap and curfew for other airports, including Brisbane. We ask again, if it is good enough for Sydney, then why is it not good enough for Brisbane? Why is it that Sydney gets a cap and curfew, but Brisbane gets none of those protections? All we're asking for are reasonable reforms and regulations, not to shut down the airport. All we're asking for is exactly what Sydney has. Brisbane Flight Path Community Association recently ran their Community Pulse survey of 1,600 residents, and they found some pretty shocking results. Because as Libby and Stephen, or members for Ryan and Brisbane, have said, the impact of flight noise and flight noise pollution on residents across Australia is devastating. It is not a trivial issue. It has serious impacts on health, physical health, mental health, and as we found out from recent surveys, independent health surveys in Melbourne can also affect childhood development. But here's what this survey found. 94% of the 1,600 respondents said their sleep was disrupted by aircraft noise. 53% at least twice a night. 66% of respondents said they were considering moving home to avoid flight noise, though many of them feel trapped and can't afford to. 57% said they have physical symptoms of stress caused by aircraft noise. These are devastating impacts on the people being impacted by this issue in Brisbane, but also residents across Australia being impacted by flight noise and flight noise air pollution. The only real substantial shift that has been achieved with regards to reducing the impact of flight noise in Brisbane has been secured by the Greens, where we have secured an amendment or a direction from the Minister to ensure that SOD props, in other words, flights departing and arriving over the water, is the preferred operating mode 24 hours at Brisbane Airport. This is the first big shift that we have seen since the second runway was proposed at Brisbane Airport. The question everyone asking is, why is it so hard to get reasonable regulations? Qantas and Virgin certainly wield enormous amounts of power over our political system and functionally act like a duopoly similar to Coles and Woolworths, and we have seen their political power and the impact that it has on decisions that are made in Parliament. Tinkering around the edges with slot reform won't fix the fundamental issues with Australian aviation industry that is highly concentrated, monopolised market that pursues corporate profit over communities, customers and workers. When they were in government during the pandemic, the Coalition gave $2.7 billion in taxpayer subsidies to Qantas that were never repaid. They still fired 10,000 workers, including 1,700 illegally, as found by the High Court. In the financial year 2022-23, Qantas recorded a profit of $2.47 billion, yet paid no income tax by bringing forward the losses from the pandemic. Shouldn't they be repaying those subsidies then that were paid to them by the federal government? We know in Queensland, when it comes to flight noise, that the Queensland government, the previous government, was subsidising late-night flights, 50 a week or thereabouts, to the tune of $100 million. Those are flights flying inside what should be a curfew period, and not only is the federal and state government refusing to support a curfew, they're actually funding flights to fly during what should be a curfew period. This includes the 1:55 a.m. Emirates flight. Emirates, who just recorded a $4 billion profit, is getting paid by the Queensland taxpayer to fly flights at the middle of the night, disrupting people's sleep. We saw a proposed third runway at Melbourne Airport, because it's not just Brisbane. An independent health study commissioned by Council found that by impacting sleeping patterns, it could potentially lead to increased rates of cardiovascular disease and may affect children's cognitive development. In fact, those zones that were most impacted by overnight flights and that could be impacted by the third runway found that children could experience a delay in reading and oral comprehension of between 3 and 5 months compared to children in lower noise areas. It makes you wonder what impacts that the flight noise in Brisbane is having on Brisbane residents where they are already exposed to it. All the Greens are proposing is we have some fair and reasonable regulations on airports across Australia, including at Brisbane. All we are proposing is a curfew and cap similar to Sydney Airport. All we are proposing is a little bit of balance, because right now what we have is an airline industry that maximises profits at the expense of everyone else. And all we're proposing is we find some balance between the profitability of the airline industry, the need to service people across Australia, and also the impacts it will have on communities. Because going forward right now, Brisbane Airport hopes to double flight traffic by 2035. That is not just unsustainable when it comes to flight noise. It's unsustainable when it comes to air pollution in the city. It's unsustainable when it comes to meeting our climate and CO2 reduction targets. It's unsustainable on every level except for the bottom line of Brisbane Airport Corporation and the profit margins of Qantas and Virgin. Are we really going to allow our political system to sacrifice the needs of ordinary Australians just to help pad the profit margins of Qantas, Virgin and Brisbane Airport Corporation?
The question now is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call a member for Kooyong.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The Sydney Airport Demand Management Act and associated legislative instruments establish a framework for the management of air traffic demand at Sydney Airport. The Act and its regulations and schemes sets a limit of 80 aircraft movements per hour at the airport, provides for a slot management scheme and guarantees access to regional services.
The framework was initially introduced largely to address community concerns about aircraft noise and capacity of the airport. The limit on aircraft operations at Sydney Airport was established to reduce the impact of noise on residents under flight paths. The slot management scheme gives airlines protected times for landing and takeoff at Sydney Airport. Slots allocated under the system permit a specified aircraft movement at a specified time on a specified day. All commercial and private aircraft require a slot to land or take off at Sydney Airport. The scheme has not functioned as it was intended. Both the Productivity Commission in 2019 and the Harris Review in 2021 have identified significant deficiencies in this scheme. Firstly, it hasn't kept pace with increasing competition for slots. Aviation industry stakeholders have long called for reforms to address the efficient use of slots, particularly given the issues relating to the curfew at the airport, the movement cap, and issues with regional access. Achieving a balance between certainty of slots for existing airlines and encouraging competition from new entrants is a key challenge of the scheme. The concept of historical precedence has been problematic. It's fundamental to the allocation of slots. Essentially, if you have one, you keep it, unless you misuse the scheme by flouting the 80-20 rule, which I will come to. But that rule requires the airline to have satisfied the relevant gate requirements for at least 80% of the slots allocated to it. So airlines can keep these slots indefinitely as long as they operate the slot as they're supposed to at least 80% of the time. This is a system which really favours incumbency. When an existing carrier seeks to change its slots, those changes are prioritised before new entrants. This is effectively a restriction on competition for those new entrants who are trying to gain access to the market. And removal of that fact was recommended by the 2021 Harris Review, but is not included in this legislation. There's also an issue with the scheme's definition of a new entrant. At present, following the allocation of slots based on that historical precedence, the slot manager is supposed to make sure that new entrants get fair access to any remaining slots. But how new entrants is defined remains problematic and, again, has not been addressed by this legislation. There are some important reforms covered by this bill. They include a requirement for additional reporting by airlines and reporting by the slot manager of how slots are allocated and used. There's a provision for a temporary increase in the number of movements allowed immediately after significant or sustained disruptions to air traffic, and that's a sensible change. It will enable the airlines to catch up after disruptions and prevent unnecessary diversions to other airports. But it's been suggested by experts in the industry that these changes are too limited in their scope and their length, and they still don't override the curfew at the Sydney Airport. The Minister can extend those recovery periods, but the process for this has been suggested to be unnecessarily cumbersome. The bill introduces a range of new civil penalties and reporting requirements to deter the problem of slot hoarding. Now, we have this existing allocation of slots based on historical precedents and this slot hoarding use it or lose it test, which requires that the airlines use at least 80% of their allocated slots. If they don't, they can use that historical precedence. But there have been suggestions, including by the administrators of Sydney Airport, that both Qantas and Virgin have repeatedly taken more slots than they intend to use in order to block other airlines gaining fair access to Sydney Airport. The airlines then spread their flight cancellations across slots to make sure that each slot is used at least 80% of the time, and they can maintain that historical precedence. Now, both Virgin and Qantas have denied engaging in slot hoarding, but there have been many suggestions that in fact is one of their preferred modus operandi. There have also been many concerns in recent years regarding the lack of competition between airlines in this country. Not just the anti-competitive behaviour like slot hoarding, but the effect of the regulatory restrictions that we see on competition in this country in both domestic and international aviation markets. This has also been exacerbated by the Albanese government's 2023 decision to reject additional international flights by Qatar Airways into Australian capital cities. Of particular concern were the impact of this lack of competition in the domestic aviation industry of the 2024 collapse of Bonza and Rex. At that time, access to slots was specifically raised by Rex as a significant barrier to its commercial competitiveness. The Minister announced measures to stop slot hoarding earlier this year in February, but they have not worked. And the most recent data that we have suggests that cancellation rates on the Sydney-Melbourne route remain really poor. In September 2024, Jetstar cancelled 9.9% of its flights, Virgin 9.3%, and Qantas was the best of a very bad bunch with 7.4% cancellations. The airlines would have us believe that these cancellations are unavoidable, that they're due to bad weather or due to the lack of air traffic controllers. But in that month of September 2024, on 17 days, there were no weather or air traffic issues, but there were still 184 cancellations. In what industry is it considered acceptable to cancel up to 1 in 5 of your services? The fact is that the 80-20 rule continues to actively incentivise slot hoarding. As long as it remains in place, slot hoarding will continue and Australian consumers will continue to pay the price. This bill fails to address a number of the significant reforms which were put on the table by reviews by the Productivity Commission, the Harris Review and the government's own aviation white paper. It doesn't increase flexibility for the slot manager to retime slots or give airlines greater flexibility to use different size aircraft. It doesn't adopt the suggested international definitions of new entrants or the internationally adopted definition of slot misuse. It doesn't change how the hourly movement cap is actioned. Those reforms, which would likely lower prices and increase choice for consumers and give efficiency benefits for airlines and for airports, are expected to be included in the slot management system, but that's not in this legislation and we will not see it almost certainly in this term of Parliament. I believe that the potential effectiveness of this legislation has been overstated by the government, which has provided a flawed impact analysis was based on the assumption that all the reforms suggested in the aviation white paper would be adopted, which, as I've already covered, is not the case. I'd like to point out as well that Australian travellers are still, every day, dealing with constant failures with customer service in the aviation industry. While other industries have a dedicated ombudsman to deal with customer complaints, the airlines have the Airline Consumer Advocate, which is funded by the airlines. In 2021, the Airline Customer Advocate was described as a glorified postbox and was awarded a Shonky Award by choice. The aviation business in this country is big enough and valuable enough to the people of Australia to have its own ombudsman. And I ask why the government has not enacted this important suggestion, which has been made by a number of independent experts, in addition to the chair of, most recently, the chair of the ACCC. This week, the Aviation Customer Advocate released its 2022 scorecard for the airlines, which is a fair demonstration, I think, of the timeliness of its responsiveness to the need for feedback on consumer services. The timing of that report, 2022, we were receiving in November 2024, reflects the effectiveness of the authority. Unsurprisingly, the Airline Customer Advocate basically gave the airlines a fail from 2022. It's very, very clear that we need an ombudsman to oversee this industry more effectively. Deputy Speaker, I've also called repeatedly in the last 2.5 years for a compensation scheme for the industry. Between grumbling airports and the behaviour of the airlines, Australian passengers need to have somebody on their side. When a flight is delayed by more than 3 hours in the EU, every passenger receives $415 on top of a full refund. In Canada, $400 Canadian. In the US, $100 US. Australian air travellers are disadvantaged by some of the worst customer protections in the Western world. When our flights are delayed or cancelled, we count ourselves lucky to receive a $20 meal voucher. While the airlines will point out that their on-time performance has improved significantly since 2022, poor service levels remain a really touchy subject for Australian travellers. And as just how committed as Qantas, Jetstar and Virgin are to delivering good service to their customers is going to be very severely tested as the Christmas holiday season rolls in. We've heard time and time again in this place in the last 2.5 years that we have an increasing number of industries which are dominated by one or two firms, which essentially represent duopolies. And we all know that we have to ensure that the balance is right between business profits and consumer rights and protections. We do not have that in the Australian aviation industry. We need a new, robust set of consumer laws for air travellers, which will be overseen by an airline ombudsman. That would shift the burden of proof back onto the airlines, and it would create a powerful incentive for the airlines to reduce their delays and cancellations more effectively than they currently do. I will continue to push hard for change in the airline industry, not just for implementation of the other remaining recommendations of the Harris Review, but also for an airline aviation industry ombudsman and a mandatory compensation scheme. With cost of living pressures continuing to hurt everyone in this country, these would be simple measures to take to make sure that the airlines aren't taking us for the worst kind of ride.
The question now is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Warringah.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak of the Sydney Airport Demand Management Amendment Bill, and I welcome that this is finally here, and I urge the government we need to do more when it comes to increasing choice for consumers when it comes to airlines in Australia. We need to make sure we don't have locked-in monopolies or duopolies, and that we make sure that there is competition. This bill addresses a long-standing issue that has compromised both the integrity of our aviation sector and the trust of Australian travellers. For years, airlines, airports and industry leaders have raised concerns about large airlines engaging in slot hoarding at Sydney Airport in particular. This practice involves scheduling more flights than they actually intend to operate, only to cancel them strategically, allowing these airlines to retain valuable slots at the expense of potential competitors. Long-term cancellation data is showing that 1 in 10 flights between Sydney and Melbourne are routinely cancelled. The Australian public needs an aviation industry that is reliable, transparent and, above all, ethical. The challenges with Sydney's airport slots management is not a new problem. Last August, the ACCC launched legal action against Qantas for failing to inform travellers of flight cancellations, alleging the behaviour was partly motivated by a desire to hold on to slots at Sydney Airport. The now defunct airline, Bonza, and we know Rex in the same way, said that they had been shut out of Sydney Airport because of the slot hoarding by the duopoly of Qantas and Virgin. This shows how the misuse of airport slots can directly affect consumer experience and industry competition. The 2021 Harris Review of the Sydney Airport Demand Management Scheme recommended a number of initiatives to improve the situation, but they have not been acted on by the former government and are really only being acted upon slowly by this government. And when one considers the amount of reliance on travel that we have in air travel in Australia, it's imperative on the government to enact those recommendations with urgency and ensure more competition is available for Australian consumers and travellers. In Warringah, my community relies heavily on tourism. Tourism plays a critical role in our broader economy nationally, but also locally in Warringah. Local businesses and jobs are reliant on a steady influx of domestic and international visitors. We know the COVID years were incredibly difficult for so many local businesses, and the difficult travellers experienced in dealing with airlines was simply often unacceptable. And so that's why so much more rigour and scrutiny needs to be applied to this sector. A number of my constituents have written in very concerned about the lack of competition in the airline industry in Australia. Constituents have also raised their concerns about the rejection by the government of Qatar Airways' application to increase flights to Australia earlier this term. This was a decision, again, that directly affected consumer choice and market fairness. So it's incredibly important for the government to make sure it enacts all recommendations of the Harris Review, but also makes sure there is that greater choice. The Sydney Airport Demand Management Amendment Bill introduces much-needed reforms to crack down on slot misuse, enhance transparency and foster a more competitive aviation industry. But more can be done. First, this bill will modernise compliance by establishing new civil penalties for slot misuse. This will provide a clear deterrent for airlines who may otherwise take advantage of the current system. But again, the proof will be in whether or not that deterrence will happen if those penalties are high enough. So that will be something to monitor to make sure that airlines don't just think of this as the cost of doing business. Second, it strengthens transparency by mandating that airlines regularly disclose slot usage. This includes reporting how slots are allocated, how they're used, and when slots are lost due to rule violations. By making this information public, this bill increases accountability and gives consumers and stakeholders insight into airline practices. Third, it enhances access for regional communities by allowing these services to apply for any available slot during any new peak period hours. This provision is critical as it offers regional travellers improved connectivity and addresses the often uneven accessibility that regional communities face. Additionally, the bill introduces a new extreme weather recovery period, which allows for a temporary increase in flights following severe weather disruptions. Given the rising frequency and intensity of extreme weather events due to climate change and our warming temperatures, this measure is particularly important. It's going to happen more and more. We know that, that's a fact. And so so many of our systems, including this one, this area, has to adjust to those realities. So this provision will ensure airlines have the processes in place to respond to weather disruptions, reducing delays and minimising the impact on passengers. So overall, the aim of this bill is to increase competition, demand greater accountability from airlines and offer better protections for Australian travellers. I welcome that. These are much needed reforms to the slot management system, in particular at Sydney Airport. So any measure that promotes integrity and transparency in business operations is a welcome measure. But I urge the government that there are further recommendations that need acting upon and to do so as soon as possible.
The question now is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. As the busiest airport in the country, Sydney Airport is undoubtedly one of Australia's most critical infrastructure assets. Yet it faces significant operational challenges due to its residential setting, limited ability to expand, and the variety of aircraft it is required to service. Domestically, the reputation of the airport has been enmeshed in an, at times, anti-competitive landscape, with practices such as slot hoarding by the major airlines leading to increased flight cancellations, delays and passenger backlash. More recently, the financial collapse of Bonza and the entering of administration arrangements for Rex Airlines have highlighted just how difficult it is to competitively service New South Wales without access to peak time slots and major routes at the Sydney Airport. With all of this said, as someone who both grew up in the bush and who now currently represents one of the most significantly impacted communities in the Sydney Basin when it comes to aircraft noise and pollution, this piece of legislation is one that really matters to my electorate of North Sydney. From the outset then, I'd like to confirm that my community does, at this stage, broadly support much-needed reforms to the Sydney Airport demand management framework. But it must be said that this support comes with a caveat. The community expects to be respected and fully engaged in any reform process. Ultimately, the proposed reforms to the slot management scheme generally align with the various recommendations of the Harris Review undertaken in 2021, and before that, the Productivity Commission's 2019 inquiry into the economic regulation of airports. And let's face it, many of us have all been on the wrong end of a cancelled flight and left with a really sinking feeling that we may not even get to our destination that day. We all want a more efficient and reliable airport experience. Reducing or removing the ability of major airlines to strategically cancel flights at the last minute will be hugely beneficial to both passengers and potential competitors alike. In addition to reduced cancellations, a more transparent and flexible slot management arrangement will allow new entrants and regional airlines to compete for peak slots, improving efficiency of operations and hopefully result in lower prices. Meanwhile, the requirement for airlines to report on slot usage, tighter rules around transferring unused slots, and other measures that increase operational efficiency and transparency are all desirable and again welcomed by my community. And backing this up with civil penalties for anti-competitive slot management practices is long overdue. However, without discounting the significant and positive reforms contained in this bill, I do want to spend some time highlighting what I see as an unnecessary amendment to the long-standing 80 aircraft movements per hour cap on air traffic. For you see, in reflecting on the original intent of the Sydney Airport Demand Management Framework, I think this legislation potentially overlooks a key issue. In 1996, following the introduction of a second north-south parallel runway at Sydney Airport, there was widespread public outcry at the exponential increase in aircraft noise and pollution, impacting communities living under and surrounding the north-south flight paths. In recognition of these communities' deserved protections and that a balance was needed to be found, one that weighed the interests of the aviation industry and the desires of the travelling public with the rights of communities living under the flight paths, John Howard and his Liberal Party took a proposed cap of 80 aircraft movements per hour and the fundamental principle that aircraft noise would be shared to the general election, and they won. That movement cap then has been the cornerstone of Sydney Airport's social licence since 1997. To change it, as this legislation proposes then, requires careful scrutiny. Currently, all non-curfew hours, that is between the hours of 6 a.m. and 11 p.m. every day, are what they call regulated hours, which means not all hours are subject to the cap of 80 movements per hour. Under the new Section 9A, the Minister will have the power to make a recovery period declaration following, I quote, a significant disruption to airport operations, and that might be a weather event or a major technical failure or security breach. The recovery period then introduces a new concept of a recovery hour, during which the cap may be temporarily increased from 80 to 85 movements per hour. The idea here is that some flights cancelled as a direct result of the significant disruption can be caught up on the same day. And in her speech, the Minister said, and I quote, "This strictly controlled recovery period will be implemented to temporarily allow up to 85 movements per hour for a maximum of 2 hours on the same day," end quote, which according to the Minister means this change will not increase noise impacts on communities. This change was something that Peter Harris recommended in his 2021 review of the Sydney Airport Demand Management Framework. He based his recommendation on the premise that if consulted, impacted communities might tolerate a small increase to operations for very short periods of time while the airport recovers from a well-defined major incident. In effect, he was suggesting that communities could be convinced to help out affected passengers. Importantly, his review highlighted that for the increase to be warranted, the following 2 hours after a serious disruption should already be fully allocated to the maximum of 80 aircraft movements per hour, and that the maximum of 80 aircraft movements, and that where this legislation now potentially, maximum 80 aircraft movements per hour, and that is where this legislation now potentially introduces a rub, in that it doesn't require that any additional capacity in alternative hours is already completely utilised before an increase in the number of flights is granted. Hence, he conceived that the impact of increasing the flight numbers might only result in an additional 10 flights over 2 hours and in very rare circumstances. However, this important qualification has not made it into this piece of legislation. Instead, the Minister may make multiple recovery period declarations on any given day with no requirement that the subsequent hours be fully allocated or that the flights being caught up are the ones that were cancelled. So the increase to the cap is not limited to 2 hours, would not be limited to 10 make-up flights a day, and may not therefore be for a very short period. To put this in context, over the course of 2024, based on data available from Air Services website, the number of aircraft movements during the peak hour of 9 to 10 a.m. on a weekday was around 66. So there is already capacity in the system to accommodate recovery flights under the existing cap. And if the cap of 85 were allowed, the number of increased flights in one recovery hour alone could be closer to 20. Mr Deputy Speaker, I think it goes without saying that none of us would be indifferent to an additional 20 flights over our backyard in an hour. In addition to the cap, the long-term operating plan for Sydney Airport provides a comprehensive technical plan for air traffic management that requires Air Services Australia to implement various noise-sharing modes, which are effectively different flight paths that utilise both the parallel and east-west runways across the day, to ensure aircraft noise and emissions are minimised or shared as widely as possible. The long-term operating plan is the subject of a ministerial direction, and Air Services is required to report on its implementation. In my role as the member for North Sydney then and a member of the Sydney Airport Community Forum, I've learnt more about air traffic management and the impacts of aircraft noise than I ever thought was possible. I know that under the long-term operating plan, my community should receive roughly 39.5% of air traffic overhead. And what is clear is that right now, with Air Services Australia are either incapable of or unwilling to implement the long-term operating plan in a way that it was originally conceived. As a result, the north-south parallel runways are overused, and those living under the north-south flight paths are being unfairly impacted. Not surprisingly then, my office has received steady, consistent correspondence from constituents at their wits' end with the relentless aircraft noise overhead. It is difficult to hear themselves speak some days. They can't work from their home, their ability to enjoy being outdoors is compromised, they cannot sleep, and ultimately it's making them sick. And it's not in their heads. Instead of the 39.5% of air traffic agreed to, communities living under the north-south flight paths are being subjected to upward of, wait for it, 90%. 90%, contrary to the long-term operating plan and contrary to the ministerial direction. This gross divergence is known and acknowledged by both Sydney Airport and Air Services Australia. This divergence then is something I've repeatedly raised on behalf of my community at the Sydney Airport Community Forum meetings, in my submissions to the Senate inquiry into the impact and mitigation of aircraft noise, and I raise it again now. While the report due back from the Senate inquiry investigating the health impacts of aircraft noise has once again been delayed, the negative health outcomes from prolonged exposure to aircraft noise and air pollution have been well documented internationally already. Aside to the impacts of wellbeing and other psychosocial outcomes, there are clear links to increased cardiovascular disease and adverse learning outcomes for children. The ability of Air Services to manage 85 aircraft movements per hour and maintain noise-sharing protocols has not been modelled, and given they are already failing to meet agreed noise-sharing targets under the existing cap, I would say that it will be, quite frankly, a miracle if this legislation works as intended and does not significantly impact my community detrimentally. In practice, this will mean any time a recovery period is declared, all flights will operate on the parallel north-south runways. And if a disruption occurs in the morning, the ability of the minister to make multiple recovery period declarations mean this could last for the rest of the day. So the effect of this legislation could be to entrench the already disproportionate and unfair allocation of aircraft noise and emissions to communities like mine that live under the north-south flight paths. This is not consistent with the right to health outcomes as purported by this bill. While the overall numbers of flights may be within the daily cap, which is presumably the basis on which the minister can state this change will not increase noise impacts on communities, the reality is the negative impact of increased movements will be borne by a very small subset of the community who have not been consulted and who will not be indifferent. Given this, I think it's incumbent on the minister to show how the additional capacity is required at all and why recovery flights cannot be accommodated within the existing operational capacity. Finally, but perhaps most importantly, the definition of a serious disruption has not been provided, and there's no indication that will be put into writing in this bill. Rather, this critical definition is currently being negotiated behind closed doors between the Minister's Office, the Department, Sydney Airport and Air Services Australia, none of whom, I would argue, have the best interests of the communities living under the flight paths at front of mind. The Harris Review repeatedly made the point that support for temporarily increasing an hourly cap and the circumstances on which that might occur should be developed in conjunction with the community to foster understanding and to maintain confidence in the demand management framework. I would have thought the Sydney Airport Community Forum representatives would have had a seat at the table in the early stages of these discussions, rather than having to wait to see the exposure draft. As I mentioned earlier, when John Howard, then both the Prime Minister and the member for Bennelong, enshrined 80 aircraft movements per hour as a cap, it was fundamentally a promise from all Australians to the negatively impacted communities that their rights mattered, that their health mattered, and that their interests were being acknowledged and upheld. I now represent those same communities, residents in Hunters Hill, Lane Cove, Boronia Park and the surrounds, and it's why I felt compelled to focus on this issue today, despite supporting the bulk of proposed reforms contained in this bill. That the current Prime Minister and the current member for Bennelong aren't standing here beside me is actually really surprising. With the abolition of the seat of North Sydney at the next election, the communities I'm fighting for today will revert to Bannalong at the next federal election, so they would expect their member to be in this chamber. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister's own community of Grandla is possibly the only community that stands to be more adversely affected than my own. Its unfortunate bill that has many positives also potentially reopens the door for a renegotiation of a long-standing social licence under which Sydney Airport operates, and that we are once again debating important legislation that transfers significant powers to the Minister without complete information. And ultimately, our communities deserve better, and I call on the government to strive to deliver just that, better for all. Thank you.
The question now is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Wentworth.
Deputy Speaker, an overhaul of Australia's aviation sector is long overdue. From flight delays, regular cancellations, the decline of low-cost carriers that provided important competition to the sector, and opaque government decisions to deny greater access to overseas carriers, the system is not delivering for customers. My constituents consistently vent to me each time airlines are in the news that all they want is reasonably priced and reliable flights. But the system doesn't change, and instead they're continuously met with poor quality services and limited options for recourse. I welcome the introduction of this bill, and while this bill just relates to the operation and efficiency of Sydney Airport, competition and efficiency for Australia's business airport has ripple effects throughout the entire system. In 2023, national cancellations were just 3.6%. However, nearly 1 in 10 flights between Sydney and Melbourne, Australia's busiest route and the 5th busiest route in the world, were cancelled. But while I support this bill, celebration is a bit premature. This bill will make rather modest changes to the operation of Sydney Airport, with only 3 of the 8 reforms signalled in the Aviation White Paper covered. The remaining 5 are expected to be delivered under reforms affecting slot management system and demand management regulations. The government has not shared details of what these changes will be, and we cannot be sure if they will go appropriately far enough. I also note that we have not yet seen the government's response to the Senate inquiry into the impact and mitigation of aircraft noise, and do not know how the government proposes to address community concerns about aircraft noise and questions about whether Sydney Airport's long-term operating plan is fit for purpose. I want to briefly speak to that because certainly the residents in some of my community are concerned about the Sydney Airport's long-term operating plan, both in terms of whether it is adhered to currently, but also whether it is fit for purpose, and particularly concerned with a lack of adequate transparency in relation to what is actually happening in terms of airline movement. Now, a lot of that data is available, but that data is quite opaquely available, and it is very difficult as a member of the public, just trying to understand what's going on, to be able to access that data very easily. So I know that is not the subject of this bill, but I want to highlight that there are many in my community who are concerned about this, and I certainly support the further engagement on this really important issue, and certainly through the Sydney Airport Community Forum. But let me return to the bill. The bill amends the Sydney Airport Demand Management Act 1997 following the Productivity Commission inquiry into economic regulation in airports and the subsequent Harris Review in 2021. Both inquiries found significant issues with efficiency, competition and governance of Sydney Airport and recommended changes. The biggest impacts this bill will have is through the introduction of recovery periods, reporting requirements on airlines and the slot manager about cancellations, as well as slot allocations and cancellations, more stringent reporting and expanded civil penalties for slot misuse. I welcome the introduction of a recovery period that will temporarily increase movements. This will allow the airport to return to regular operating capacity quicker following weather events. I do welcome the penalties and stricter reporting obligations on airlines for cancellations and irregular slot movements. However, I question whether the penalties are sufficiently strong deterrent to prevent slot hoarding and other forms of slot misuse that make it difficult for new entrants to compete. I also welcome the decision to attempt to appoint the slot manager by a process of competitive tender, but note that the bill is silent on the issue of airline ownership of this. Deputy Speaker, these changes are positive, but they are unlikely to significantly move the dial on competition in the aviation sector. I acknowledge that further changes have been slated under foreshadowed changes to the slot management scheme, and I eagerly await this detail. But there are also some missed opportunities. Stakeholders in the aviation sector that I've spoken to are disappointed with the decision not to make changes to the 80-20 rule. This rule adopts a use it or lose it approach to gate movements, requiring airlines to use the allocated slot for at least 80% of the time. While the Harris Review discussed but stopped short of shifting to a stronger test, such as 90-10, stakeholders I've consulted consider 80% to be too low a threshold to genuinely open up competition and limit slot hoarding. Similarly, both the Productivity Commission and the Harris Review found that the 15-minute rolling window in the movement cap had outlived its usefulness, and removing this would allow movements to happen more smoothly and reduce delays. But it is unclear why this modest change was not adopted. These changes that the bill represents are positive, but they are late. The Productivity Review was conducted in 2019, and the Harris Review was conducted in 2021. The issue with efficiency and competition in the airline sector has been a problem known to governments of both stripes for a long time. Yet it took until last year to get a green paper and August this year to get a white paper. That's a space of 6 years and 4 years between the respective reports and the release of an action plan, not to mention legislation. Now, I note that this is not all to do with the current government. This is also an issue in relation to the previous government and the delays in taking action on these issues, but it is one that does concern me. And I think this is reflective of a broader problem that we have where governments commission reviews, reports and recommendations, but those reviews, reports and recommendations are often sometimes not made public and often just left to gather dust, and rarely is the government actually fully obliged to respond and provide clear guidance on whether they're going to go ahead with the recommendations. For instance, I look at the Productivity Commission's report. Productivity is one of the biggest issues. Our productivity gap is one of the biggest issues facing our country at the moment in terms of economic performance. We have the Advancing Prosperity report released by the Productivity Commission, whose main job is to enhance productivity in this country. This report was released in 2021. It still does not have a government response. We have two separate reports criticising the allocation of billions of dollars in federal infrastructure investment, and again, we do not have formal government responses. In New South Wales, where I'm from, tabled reports require a government response within 6 months. And I think our track record suggests that some sort of legislated discipline is what government needs of all stripes, including a legislated obligation to actually table reports that are commissioned and table those reports in full, so that the community who is paying for the reports and who also contribute to the reports in the work that they do in advocating and certainly all the work that stakeholders do in advocating, that those reports actually have the consideration of the government of the day. Thank you.
The question now is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the Assistant Minister.
Thanks, Speaker. Sydney Airport's the busiest airport in the country. 38 million passengers came through the airport last year. It's also an economic powerhouse. It employs well over 30,000 people in high-skilled, important jobs.
Order. A division has been called for in the House. The proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division. The proceedings will resume when the Chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or subsequent divisions. The Federation Chamber is suspended until 4 p.m. this afternoon.